the dawn light touched the horizon as Dr. Eleni Vassiliou stood at the rail of the research vessel Nereid, watching the Aegean Sea stretch endlessly and blue before her. She'd spent her career chasing mysteries hidden beneath its waves, sunken theatres, submerged towns, ghostly canals carved into the stone. But today's mission was different. She would lead Triton, her advanced underwater drone, into an uncharted trench as straight as any man-made aqueduct. No diver had ever seen its depths, no chart had ever mapped its length. And in that unknown lay a deeper truth. Earth's surface is in constant motion, and the land we take for granted, our islands, our coasts, our ground beneath our feet, can vanish as suddenly as it appeared. Eleni watched the technicians lower Triton into the water, its powerful lights carving a cone through the Aegean's gentle sleep. As the drone descended, the sea closed above Eleni's head like a curtain, and she joined the control room, where sonar displays painted a living map of undulating sand and scattered boulders. Then, like a razor through butter, a linear gouge appeared. A channel, nearly a kilometre long, walls rising in perpendicular geometry, and a flat base etched with ridges at perfect intervals. The trench was too precise to be a natural rift, and the team's collective heart raced. In that instant, Eleni felt herself crossing into a new frontier. Once back on deck, over steaming mugs of coffee, the crew pored over Triton's recordings. Close-up footage of bronze collars embedded in tufa stone, gear-like ridges floating in the downstream current, and eeriest of all, a metal plate etched with star patterns, constellations matching the brass star dial recovered years earlier from a Black Sea wreck. As they compared images of spiral depressions off Malta and stone-carved fish traps in Canada's Lake Huron, the same realization took hold. Human beings in prehistory and antiquity had mastered environmental engineering so advanced that modern textbooks scarcely mention it. And then, through war, flood, or cultural collapse, those feats vanished, buried beneath sand, mud, or water, until our own technologies caught up and revealed their outlines. In the hours that followed, Eleni and the team embarked on multiple dives. They recovered sediment cores from the trench floor, each layer a page of history. Organic remains carbon dated to about 6800 BCE, confirming that rising post-glacial sea levels had drowned the channel. They mapped corrosion layers on the bronze collars. Sulfide patinas formed in oxygen-poor mud for millennia, later overlaid by iron oxides when storms scoured the silt in medieval times. They collected wood splinters from collapsed support beams, oak planks that radiocarbon were placed in the same era as early Neolithic villages. Taken together, these data sewn into a patchwork timeline revealed that Mesolithic hunters or early farmers had carved the trench, stupefying details into prehistoric bedrock. That night, Eleni sat alone in the lab, poring over cross-sections of the trench and comparing them to GPS surveys of shifting barrier islands off Virginia's coast. There, hurricanes had reshaped the shore almost overnight. She reflected on Doggerland, the vast plain once connecting Britain to France, now submerged beneath the North Sea. Her mind raced through vanished lands, Socotra's lost coral reefs, the sunken temples of Pumpuha, the drowned houses of Siberian coasts collapsing into Arctic waves. Each story spoke of impermanence, tectonic heaves that raised mountains, volcanic islands that sank, ice sheets that locked Earth's water and then released it to engulf coastlines. In the days that followed, the Nereid moved on, deploying drones off Portugal, tracing manta ray gaps in the seabed that hinted at another civilization's gridwork, a checkerboard of trenches and embankments. In the Caribbean, magnetometer arrays detected buried coils beneath coral atolls. In Japan's inland sea, sonar picked out spiral terraces mirroring Malta's concentric arms. Each anomaly was a buried machine, an environmental library of human ingenuity catalogued only in the ocean's deep, stable darkness. While hardware whirred and software rendered 3D reconstructions, Eleni found herself retelling the same cautionary parable. For every island that appears, another disappears. Barrier spits along the Ganges Delta sink under subsiding river silt. Coral atolls shrink as the reef corals bleach and die. Permafrost shores collapse without ice's binding grip. We erect seawalls and groins, dredge sediments for nourishment, replant mangroves, and yet the forces of Earth, tectonics, climate, biology, remain more powerful than any single intervention. By the end of the expedition, Eleni stood again at the rail as the sun sank. She thought of the soldier engineers who had carved Roman aqueducts, of the Mesolithic artisan who had chiselled the Aegean trench with antler picks and fire-cracked stone. She imagined Viking shipwrights whose keel storms claimed off Greenland's coast, Polynesian navigators whose atoll farms drowned in king tides, Arctic hunters losing islands to eroding sea ice. They all built, they all vanished. Now we uncover their works in silted silence. Eleni closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the ship's engines as if they were the earth itself breathing. She felt both awe and humility. Our ancestors were not primitive. They were builders who applied the same curiosity and skill we see in Triton's lasers and our best underwater robotics. Their machines still whisper beneath waves and mud, pushing us to rewrite history as a spiral of lost and regained knowledge, rather than a straight line of constant progress. As she opened her eyes, Eleni spoke the words that had guided her dives and would echo through every report and lecture she delivered. So dive carefully. You may not be alone in the dark. I first heard about tectonic uplift on a misty morning in Okinoshima, the westernmost of Japan's Oki Islands. The ferryman, a weather-beaten man named Hiroshi, guided our small boat into a sheltered cove beneath sheer cliffs of red sandstone. He pointed to a band of pale barnacles clinging halfway up the cliff face, miles above today's high tide line, and spoke with reverence, almost apology. "Look there," he said, voice low. "My grandfather told me those shells once grew in the sea, as our grandparents told theirs. Over generations the land rose. We rose with it." We climbed a narrow stair carved into rock, winding past terraces of walnut trees and modest farmsteads. At the top, the village of Amma greeted us with low wooden houses and a fishing port that seemed oddly distant from the sea. Fishermen tied their boats to moorings set on ground now fully exposed at low tide, their nets drying on racks that once sat half submerged. The air smelled of pine and cedar smoke, land smells, more than ocean smells. Dr. Mari Sakamoto, our geologist, knelt beside a rocky outcrop and scraped away a bit of orange lichen to expose faint ripple marks. "These were formed under water," she said, voice echoing with excitement. "Then, as the Eurasian and North American plates shifted, this whole shelf was uplifted. Over thousands of years, those ripple beds rose by over a metre per century." She tapped her GPS recorder. "Right now, these islands are rising at about 2 to 3 millimetres per year, enough to leave the barnacles high and dry." Hiroshi joined us, arms folded behind his back. "We adapt," he said simply. "We plant higher, we build terraces, but the sea remembers its old boundaries. The fish still come to the old inlets, even if they're now fields of grain." From Japan to Alaska is a journey of 2 hemispheres and a world apart. In coastal southeast Alaska, subsidence rather than uplift has marked the landscape. I first saw it from the deck of the research vessel Skua, where geophysicist Dr. Fiona Blake stood peering at the old charts. Beneath the radar flat calm, she explained, lay forests drowned by post-glacial rebound, or rather, lack thereof in this region. After the ice retreated, she said, tracing a line on the chart, the land began rebounding everywhere, but not here. The weight of ice was less, so the land sank, and the crust flexed differently. As sea level stabilized around 7000 BCE, these shores were slowly submerged. Entire Tlingit villages, once perched on high bluffs, now lie beneath deeper water. She showed us videos taken by ROVs, spruces and hemlocks standing upright in water up to 10 metres deep, their stumps sheared off by centuries of tides. Barnacles and starfish clung to trunk sections that had once supported roofs. Fish darted among submerged houses. On shore, driftwood, some carved into totem posts, lay half buried in silt and eelgrass, moss-scarred by decades of salt water. We sailed into a narrow inlet named Cake. Fiona pointed to an abandoned hamlet on the starboard slope. "Most residents left in the 60s, she said. "Roads were flooded, and freshwater wells brackish. Houses rotted, foundations collapsed. Today, the water's edge laps the doorstep, erasing footprints with every tide." A local elder, Samuel Jackson, joined our small landing boat. His face bore maps of life lived between water and land. "My great-grandparents lived above that line," he said, pointing inland. "Now even I have to move uphill, but I miss the smell of spruce when I walked in my grandmother's yard. The land gives and the land takes." Between those 2 coasts, tectonic motion writes its own autobiography. In New Zealand, the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake uplifted stretches of seabed by nearly 2 meters in places. I watched geologists measure locked mussel beds now far above the surf. The ladders of marine life, once marching up the intertidal, stood empty at unexpected heights, a living record of Earth's sudden heave. How often do we get to witness uplift in human lifetimes? Asked Dr. Hannah Waitiri, a Maori cultural geographer. Our ancestors spoke of these events in myth, Tawera Matea's anger, Roamoko's rumblings, but few understood the scale. Now, we can measure directly and map how communities must adjust their gardens, their roads, their lives. At sunrise, Hannah led us to a coastal marae, once precisely located at sea level for canoe landings, now perched on high ground, its meeting house doors looking down on a newly formed intertidal bench. She placed a hand on the carved threshold, eyes closed. "We must adapt our traditions as the land adapts itself," she said softly. Then she taught us the Waiata, song that commemorates that shift, embedding geological awareness into cultural memory. Not all tectonic play is so visible. Along the West African coast in the Gulf of Guinea, I dove amid mangrove roots in a delta region where modern subsidence, driven partly by groundwater extraction and partly by sediment compaction, worsens natural sea level rise. Local villagers in Delta State, Nigeria, told me of villages that had met the sea too eagerly, houses leaning into brackish water, dikes collapsing, freshwater swamps transformed into lagoons. Once rice paddies, lamented Chief Awosika, pointing across the mangrove lagoon, now fishing grounds for tilapia. We cope, but at what cost? Our forebears cultivated rice where I fish today. This modern subsidence wasn't tectonic, but had similar effects. Dry land yields to sea. Ground-penetrating radar beneath Cypress Knees near Charleston, South Carolina, had shown centuries of compaction beneath plantations, until seawater claimed low-lying rice fields in a slow but unrelenting advance. The rhythm of subsidence and inundation repeated what I'd seen in Alaska, but driven by different causes. In the North Atlantic, the Faroe Islands tell another tale of tectonic motion. These craggy peaks once sat deeper beneath ancient seas, then rose over glacial cycles. Local fishermen still speak of drowning sounds they hear on calm nights, as if the ocean were admonishing the land for rising. At Vestmanna, I sat beside cliffs where seabirds nested on bench-like terraces. Radiocarbon samples of peat below the nests dated back 10 millennia, indicating emergence from the waves only 5,000 years ago. A schoolteacher, Sunea Johansson, recounted class lessons on isostatic rebound, how the rising land allowed sheep grazing on slopes that were once ocean floor. "Our sheep may be goats in disguise," she joked, "but they live on land the sea once claimed. We walk on the bones of the ocean." Even farther north, Hudson Bay's shores reveal a dramatic post-glacial rebound. The land pent up under kilometres of ice now springing upward at rates of nearly a centimetre per year. At Churchill, Manitoba, scientists chart how new land emerges each season, congesting boat channels and altering Arctic char spawning grounds. The indigenous Cree bands, whose ancestors once lived on the islands in mid-bay, now traverse freshwater lakes formed where tides once lapped. "Our stories told of land going up," said Elder Clara Manitowabi, holding an eagle feather as she recited a time-honoured prophecy. "We watched rocks break free from the shore and become islands under our canoes. Now we watch again, knowing the land is alive." Contrast these slow dramas with sudden subsidence driven by megaquakes. In Chile's 1960 Valdivia earthquake, the most powerful ever recorded, land sank by up to 2 meters in giant coastal segments, drowning farms and rail lines in one night. I met a retired rail engineer, Don Alberto, now in his 80s, who described waking to a strange warbling as tracks buckled and shifted like ribbon on water. "The land flexed," he said, voice still trembling. "My tools and my gauge pins tumbled off tables. When I ran outside, the smoking stacks of the sawmill were half submerged where land once stood." Chile's bays became harbourless quagmires until sediment built up again. Communities rebuilt higher, but the geography had been rewritten in a single seismic breath. It underscored that tectonic motion is not only an academic drift, but a human story of loss and adaptation. In the Indian Ocean, I joined a team exploring Kandavu in Fiji, where coral reef islands had surged upward by as much as 1 metre following the 1856 and 1853 earthquakes. Marine terraces, flat platforms cut by waves, stood at heights as much as 5 metres above current sea level, each inscribed with footprints of ancestors. Villagers still fish from these terraces, patched with cultivated patches of taro and coconut. They call them the islands of their grandparents, islands that rose overnight in living memory. Chief Ratu Tupu told me, when the islands lifted, the currents changed, and the fish came closer. Our families moved to the new shorelines. We learned to plant new crops. The earth gives and takes. We must flow with it. Farther south, Tasmania's east coast preserves evidence of a slow subsidence phase around 4,000 years ago. Submerged forest stumps now grow beneath 2 metres of water near Maria Island. Diving among bleached roots, I felt the hush of passing centuries. Aboriginal middens, once built on headlands, now lie beneath waves, their shell deposits recording a final meal by a people forced to move inland as the cold southern ocean slowly swallowed their seal-rich coastal camps. Archaeologist Peter Hughes showed me the OSL, optically stimulated luminescence dates of sands above those stumps. We have a 600-year window when sea level sat exactly here, he explained. By 800 CE the site was gone. People moved uphill. Their stories echo in the surf. In the North Atlantic subpolar realms, the Inner Hebrides near Scotland exhibit both uplift and subsidence along fault lines. Skerry lands, small islands, once joined, now separated by a few metres of water, tell a tale of complex fault-driven tilting. Fishermen like Angus MacLeod navigate channels that were dry platforms in the early medieval age. Oral traditions speak of ruins glimpsed beneath calm waves, the shore fort of Dunchonald, once at sea level, now a submerged silhouette. "The stones are there," Angus assured me, peering through polarised glasses. "If you've got an underwater camera, you see walls dancing in the blue. We class them as old spirits guarding old ways." Across the Pacific, the Philippines' Sulu Sea holds land during the 1976 Morro Gulf earthquake. Entire coastal villages lifted up to a metre, their lagoons drained in minutes. Crops flooded, then dried, wells cracked. Villagers looked on as water drained from fish ponds, leaving boats grounded on red clay flats. One fisherman, Ali Haroun, recalled the morning when his net yielded nothing but mud. "We had to carry water back to the shoreline where there was nothing but land," he said. Each subplot of uplift or subsidence unfolds human adaptation. Moving gardens, recisterning water, recalibrating boat landings, rewriting place names. No plot is too small for tectonic script. In coastal Louisiana, levees and dredging alongside natural subsidence fueled by sediment compaction have accelerated land loss by metres a year. A single hurricane can transform a parish of swamps into open water fields. Ile de Jean Charles, a narrow island of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw community, has lost 80% of its area since 1955. Residents now plan relocation inland as water encroaches on house steps. "These marshes gave our people a way of life," said matriarch Valerie Castile, standing at the water's edge. "Now each year, they're less. The ground sinks, the sea comes, we adapt again." Looking back at these global vignettes, a pattern emerges. Tectonic uplift and subsidence act on timescales from seconds to millennia. They rewrite coastlines, orphan villages, reshape ecosystems, and force cultures to adapt or vanish. Islands can rise from the depths to host fields of wheat, only to disappear under new waves centuries later, becoming marine terraces for distant researchers to photograph. Shorelines once stable can liquefy with a quake, leaving behind ecological deserts of brine and sand. For geologists, these stories converge in maps layered with GPS uplift measurements, radiocarbon dates, OSL windows, and coral micro-atoll records. Each data point ties land to time. For historians, they underscore the contingency of human settlement. Ports built on uplifted plains, lost to subsiding seas, harbours scoured by sudden tilts, redirecting trade routes, coastal shrines drowned or exposed. For communities, they inform disaster planning, cultural memory, and the politics of relocation. As the era of rapid sea level rise dawns once again, driven by ice melt and thermal expansion, these tectonic narratives gain new urgency. In places where uplift offsets rising waters, communities may gain time to adapt. where subsidence accelerates land loss, even modest rises can spell disaster. Understanding the interplay of tectonic drift and climate-driven sea level change is essential for forecasting futures. On Okinoshima, Hiroshi's grandchildren still farm terraces set above barnacle benches. In southeast Alaska, Samuel Jackson's great-grandchildren fish among drowned stumps. In Kaikoura, new coastal highways and community halls stand above uplifted marine terraces. In Louisiana, the Isle de Jean-Charles Band plans relocation along carefully selected ground with minimal subsidence. All have learned from the Earth's motion to monitor, to adapt, and to prepare. As I left the Faroe Islands by ferry beneath low, heaving clouds, I realised that the world's coastlines and islands are not static backdrops but living interfaces between the solid Earth and the fluid sea. Their stories are inscribed in coral platforms, submerged forests, tilted temples, and barnacle rings. They remind us that the ground beneath our feet and under our waves is dynamic, shaped by forces both slow and sudden. Whether uplifted or submerged, these lands speak of resilience and change. They teach us that no place is permanent, and yet humanity persists, forging new homes, rebuilding traditions, and writing fresh chapters on shifting shores. In that ceaseless dance of land and water, we find both challenge and hope, reminders that our geography is alive, that adaptation is our enduring legacy. The first time I saw Surtsey was from the deck of a small research vessel while rocking on the cold Atlantic swell. It was May 1975, 2 years after the island had been born in a fount of fire and ash, and its black volcanic cone still billowed steam as seawater met incandescent rock. Our expedition's captain, Jon Gudmundsson, pointed through binoculars at the grey plume rising into the sky. "It began here," he said, voice low with awe, "when magma breached the seafloor and exploded into the sea. In weeks, we had a new island." I strapped on my boots and helmet and joined the tide-swept landing team who stepped ashore onto the slick, still-hot beaches. The roar of surf against raw lava was deafening, and the ground trembled underfoot with the pulse of the cooling flows. Basalt sheets cracked with loud snaps, sending steam flying as seawater boiled in the fissures. In that moment, I felt the power of creation itself, an island rising strand by strand, layer by layer, from the dark ocean floor. Over the weeks that followed, Surtsey grew higher, its cone swelling with each eruption. Observers charted the ash clouds, measured sulfur dioxide emissions, and mapped lava advances. The world watched as sea cliffs formed, new beaches appeared, and a barren wasteland slowly took shape. Computer models of volcanic cones, refined by Surtsey's real-time data, would become textbooks in the decades to come. But even as we marvelled at the birth, a quieter drama was already underway. Powerful Atlantic waves battered the new coastline, carving undercuts beneath the fragile basalt and ripping lumps of rock into the surf. Hydrothermal alteration in the vents weakened the lava, while pounding swells ground the shore into grey sand. Just a few years. The island's flanks would slump in landslides, and chunks of its once proud cone would collapse into the churning sea. By my next visit in 1975, the southern beaches had retreated by tens of metres. We hiked up to the crater rim, now fenced off to protect nesting gulls, and peered over a ledge undermined by erosion. In places, the basalt formed jagged fins jutting into the waves. In others, it had fallen away, exposing subterranean chambers where molten rock had once flowed. I placed a marked stone at the rim's edge, only to return in 90 and find it a dozen metres closer to the surf. Each visit erased that perimeter, inch by inch, as erosion reclaimed the newborn land. Yet Surtsey is a protected laboratory of life, and while the land recedes, biologists have chronicled an astonishing array of colonisation. Lichens first flickered grey on bare rock, then mosses carpeted sheltered hollows, insects and spiders found niches, and seabirds nested amid the cooling rubble. Surtsey taught us that while volcanoes build islands, life will almost immediately begin to claim them, even as the sea gnaws them back. Half a world away, in the Azores archipelago, I once stood on Sugarloaf Island Pão de Açúcar to Portuguese fishermen, where the story of balance between creation and erosion is even more drawn out. Formed by Miocene to Pliocene volcanism some 3 million years ago, Sugarloaf once rivaled its larger neighbours in height. But over eons, relentless weathering and wave action wore its lava flows into valleys, forming ridges and gullies. Today it is a low-lying islet, a remnant of that grand volcanic age, its cliffs pocked by sea caves and its summit no more than 10 meters above high tide. I walked the narrow trail that circled Sugarloaf's perimeter, the wind whipping salt spray in my face. Beneath my feet lay Pahoho flows, smooth to pebbles. Around me stretched shallow coves where seagrasses took root in lava fragments. Gulls swooped overhead, and below, urchins and limpets grazed on rock flats, a fragile ecosystem, clinging to the edge of a vanishing landmass. Thousands of years ago, my guide told me, this was a mountain. He traced the horizon to the larger island of São Miguel. Today, half of it is gone, ground to sand or slipped beneath the waves. In the Azores, island lifespans span millions, not years. But erosion's constant dry prane, wave, wind eventually reclaims every peak. There is elegance in the slow cadence. Basalt pillars crumble to talus, talus to sand, sand to silt, and silt to ocean floor once more. Along the South American coast, I joined geologists studying Tristan da Cunha's rugged shores. They too spoke of ancestral volcanoes, now reduced to skeletons of black stone, perched like sentinels on the sea. Volcanic islands come in many flavors. Some, like Hawaii's Big Island Air, built on hotspots continuously supplying magma. Their flanks expand through repeated eruptions, outpacing erosion for millennia. Others, like Surtsey, form in brief but dramatic bursts, only to fade as the lava supply wanes. Then there are mid-ocean ridges that raise atolls of basalt pillow lavas, which form the foundation for coral reefs like those of the Marquesas. Over time, the volcanic foundations subsides a geologic dance step known as thermal subsidence, and the reef, if it keeps pace, becomes a ringed atoll as the peak sinks beneath the waves. On a coral atoll in the Pacific, I snorkeled above a drowned volcanic caldera. Below the lens of pristine water lay fish darting among living coralla, vibrant sign of life's persistence. But dive deeper, past the bleaching front, and you glimpse piles of eroded basalt boulder screws to the island that once soared above the waves. Without active volcanism to refresh its rock, the reef island depended on the coral to rebuild its foundation. When coral health faltered under warming seas, the island's risk of wholesale erosion spiked. The creation and decay of volcanic islands thus teaches an enduring lesson. Geological youth is fleeting. New land can be born in years or centuries, and then reclaimed in millennia or less. Human timescales shrink this drama even further. By 1985, tirelessly documenting Surtsey, scientists noticed its shoreline had retreated by more than 200 meters since its formation. Vegetation had established itself fully on a landmass now half its original size. They calculated that by the mid-21st century, only the island's core would remain, until finally the ocean reclaimed it entirely. On the slopes of Hawaii's Kilauea, I hiked across lava flows less than a decade, old gleaming Pahoho ribbons, ropey and sharp, still warm in spots from residual heat. Nearby, the shoreline at Kalapana had been buried under new lava, pushing the ocean back. But at the new oceanfront, newly formed cliffs were collapsing within months. Hexagonal lava tubes collapsed under wave action, sending debris into the surf. The island's perimeter, newly extended by molten rock, was already being eaten away. I spent a dawn on a black sand beach watching lava flow into the ocean, an explosive meeting of fire and water. Steam rose in white plumes as fragments of spatter chilled in the sea, forming fragile madrone islands that slid beneath my feet. It was a reminder that volcanic construction is inextricable from erosional destruction. Each advance carries the seed of retreat. On remote Loihi Seamount, off Hawaii's southeast coast, I peered through a ROV's viewport at pillow lavas growing under miles of water. Loihi rises more than 3.0 meters above the seafloor, but its summit sits 975 meters below the surface, destined in tens of thousands of years to breach the waves as a new island. But until then, its fiery breath builds the same framework of basalt that Surtsey would one day borrow, but only to lose in turn. In Iceland, beyond Surtsey, I visited Eldfell on Heimathvestmannaeyjar eruption of 1973 that forced the town's evacuation and added 4 million cubic meters of new lava in 6 days. Locals trucked seawater onto the advancing flows to slow them, building makeshift quays to divert lava away from the harbour. That human intervention saved the town, but the island's coastline changed in irreversible ways. New peninsulas, altered currents, shifting sediment deposition. In the years since, Eldfell's bulk has slumped, its cliffs retreating, and the new lava fields are eroding under North Atlantic storms. Back in the Azores, I joined a biologist studying bird colonies on islet of Vilafranca do Campo, a near a circular pillar of basalt rising from Porto Pim Bay. It sprouted from an underwater tuff cone, only to erode the loose ash and lapilli into the sea over centuries, leaving a volcanic chimney encircled by a jagged funnel. Puffins nest in crevices that were once part of the cone's inner walls. Gulls roost on narrow ledges. Below, scuba divers map grottos once buried under harder ash that erodes more slowly than the surrounding tuff. The islet itself is a testament to volcanic reshaping. Rise, build, erode, and leave a solitary rock as all that remains of a once-aground island. Each expedition I undertake traces the same arc. Undersea fire births land, volcanic processes sculpt it, waves and wind reshape it, and time subsides it back beneath the waves. From Surtsee's newborn cone to Sugarloaf's ancient eroded shard, from Hawaii's expanding lava flows to the submerged slopes of Loihi, the story is universal. Islands are temporary bookmarks in Earth's vast narrative, their pages written in basalt and erased by sea. In the evening, as I watched a final sunset over Surtsee's smoky summit from the deck of the research vessel, the sky burned in crimson and gold. I thought of the cycles of creation and destruction, the lessons of adaptation we glean from them. If we ever learn to live in harmony with such powerful forces, building resilient coastal cities, protecting reef foundations, respecting earthquake-prone shores, perhaps our own legacies will last longer than the islands that came before. But even if we fail, the Earth will endure, writing new islands in fire and reclaiming old ones in water. And the story will continue. Islands born, islands drowned, in the endless dance of tectonic passion and oceanic patience. The day I first learned that Britain had once been married to continental Europe, I was standing knee-deep in North Sea water, scanning the horizon where rolling waves met a cold grey sky. The tide was out, revealing a stretch of mudflats that fishermen called the Dogger Bank, named for the shallow sandbank that haunted trawlers' nets for centuries. No one thought of it as anything more than a navigational hazard until modern sonar surveys whispered a far older tale. A sunken land, fertile and green, where forests once stood and herds of megafauna grazed, where people hunted, gathered, and built their homes. It was the spring of 2005 when I joined a multidisciplinary team of archaeologists, geologists, and marine surveyors aboard the research vessel Proteus. Our mission: to map the seabed off the coasts of Norfolk and Lincolnshire, and to glimpse the artifacts and landscapes buried beneath. We carried coring equipment, side-Auscan sonar, sub-eye bottom profilers, and hope that Doggerland's story might still lie intact under layers of sediment. The North Sea that morning was deceptively calm. Seabirds wheeled overhead, and distant wind farms shimmered like modern monoliths on the horizon. We lowered the towed sonar fish and watched in wonder as dark patches on the seabed came into focus. Sinuous channels winding like rivers, ridges that could only be drumlins, and hollow depressions shaped like former lakes. It was a landscape of rolling hills and watercourses, drowned by a great flood at least 80 years ago. Dr. Miriam Evans, our paleo-environmentalist, leaned over my shoulder. "There," she said, tracing her finger on the screen. "A paleo channel carved by a river long ago, and that ridge likely a moraine left by glacial retreat. Beneath us lies the end of the last ice age, preserved in mud." As the sonar beam passed over each feature, I felt time unwind. We were witnessing a lost world, the geometry of a landscape erased by rising seas but still inscribed in its bed. Beneath our hull, Doggerland's valleys, hills, and marshes slept, awaiting rediscovery. That first night, our cores arrived back on deck. Technicians sliced open the PVC tubes. Dark peat layers, marine clays, traces of pollen from alder and hazel, and microscopic snail shells. One core contained a lens of burned charcoal and flint flakes, suggesting a hearth site where Mesolithic people warmed their hands or roasted game. Radiocarbon dating placed that charcoal at around 7,000 BCE, just before the final inundation swept their homeland under brackish tidal waters. We assembled in the lab, dusty with mud and diesel fumes, to discuss the finds. Each layer of peat told a story of forested swamps. Each stratum of clay marked the first incursion of salt water. Sea level rise accelerated as the last ice sheets melted, drowning Doggerland in a watery embrace. By 500 BCE, what remained was a scattering of islands and shoals. Today's Dogger Bank no more than low ridges above deepening channels. As word of our cause spread through the scientific community, press coverage erupted. Headlines proclaimed Britain's Atlantis, and radio programs featured excited narrators speculating about sunken Stone Age temples. Tourists booked Dover-Vlissingen ferry crossings, dreaming of walking across the ancient causeway at low tide. But those who came seeking physical remnants found only a cold, shifting sea. It wasn't until late August, when the sky blustered with autumn squalls, that we recovered our first unequivocal artifacts from the bed. Our ROV's suction arm brought up a struck flint point, its edge still sharper, perfectly preserved arrowhead, probably used to hunt red deer or wild boar. Encrusted in marine growth and barnacles, it looked like a relic from another world. We washed it in fresh water on the deck, then passed it around in awe. The hum of engines and the creak of rigging fell away, as each of us felt the weight of human hands that had flung that point at a creature, seeking both sustenance and survival. Dating placed that arrowhead at 800 BCE, when sea level stood just meters below the local high ground. Doggerland's inhabitants lived in a landscape of wetlands and woodlands, a world of estuaries carved by the Rhine, Seine, Thames, and Scheldt rivers coalescing into a grand delta. They built seasonal camps on higher ridges, fished in shallow channels, and tracked the herds that moved through the flourishing forest. For millennia, they thrived in that place until the waters came. As we recovered more flints and tools, a pattern emerged. Flint scatters clustered on what had been coastal terraces. At depths of 40 to 50 meters, we located submerged hearths. In marine clays spanning the 560 BCE window, we found remnants of wooden platform structures that might have served as fish traps or raised walkways through marsh. Each fragment expanded our understanding of how people adapted to a rising shoreline, building ephemeral landscapes on the edge of disappearance. Back on land, I traveled to the Norfolk coast to meet descendants of the region's earliest inhabitants. I stood on Cromer Beach, gazing at the chalk cliffs that once overlooked Doggerland's valleys. Local folklore spoke of grey dunes, where hunters tracked deer across the sands at low tide. A man named Tom Everett, whose family had fished those waters for generations, showed me a brass plaque from his grandmother's cottage, inscribed, "When the tide is out, you can glimpse the lost land where our ancestors walked." He pointed at a marker indicating where the shoreline had stood 2 centuries ago, and then, with the sea at his back, yet pointed to the horizon where waves still washed Doggerland's buried plains. "It's in our bones," he said softly. "We fish these waters, but we feel the pull of that land beneath. Sometimes in the net we pull up old wood, roots soaked in salt. You can see the grain, feel the life it once had. That life, once above sea level, became a submerged archive, safe from erosion and weathering but concealed from human eyes. High winds and storm surges churn the seabed, mixing ancient artifacts with marine sediment, so that every core or trawl brings fragments of a vanished world. We were piecing together that world, sediment by sediment, flake by flake, each discovery a jigsaw of Mesolithic life. Our project grew into an international consortium, Doggerland Research, which pooled resources and data. Dutch, German, Danish, and British teams joined in, recognizing that Doggerland was not the monopoly of any modern border, but a submerged plain linking countries into a shared prehistory. We standardized methods for surveying, coring, radiocarbon dating, and artifact conservation. We built a GIS model of the paleo landscape, reconstructing river courses, lake basins, and forest boundaries as they changed through time. Field schools took students to the Dogger Bank's margins, where they learned both sonar and flint napping techniques. Conference halls filled with talks on submerged Mesolithic migration corridors and climate-driven cultural collapse. the flood of data reshaped our understanding of human resilience and vulnerability. Doggerland's drowning was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual encroachment, an incremental rise of a few millimeters per year, interspersed with abrupt storm surges that breached the last ridges. Every generation witnessed a loss. Camps once on dry land became islands, then shoals, then nothing more than ripples beneath the sea. In the laboratories, I watched as technicians dusted artifacts with brushes and recorded grain-size distributions in sediment. I studied pollen counts, showing transitions from forest to marsh to open water. I wrote papers on how rising water displaced human movement along river terraces. Overwhelmingly, the narrative was one of adaptation coastal dwellers, building fish traps in tidal channels, exploiting estuarine resources as inland resources dwindled, but also one of disappearance, as floodplains drowned beyond repair. Standing on the Proteus's deck one evening, under a blood-red sunset, I felt the swell of the sea below me as the heartbeat of a different world. Here lay Doggerland's buried glades, the highways of mammoths and reindeer, the villages whose mounds are now buried so deep we might never find them. Below, in the dark, lay the buried memory of humanity's early mastery of wetland landscapes, testament to both ingenuity and the inexorable power of nature. In the decades since, offshore wind farms have encroached on the Dogger Bank, drilling monopiles into the mud. Environmental impact assessments must now consider ancient landscapes alongside marine ecosystems. Occasionally, a seabed construction ram pings through a paleochannel, and a core brings up a flake of flint that becomes a headline as "Prehistoric Doggerland Artifact Recovered." Fishermen still pull up ancient wood and bone in their nets, some taking it home as lucky charms, others selling it to museums. These submerged relics force us to rethink the narrative of Britain and Europe as islands and peninsulas shaped solely by political tides. They remind us of a time when migration routes crossed shallow plains, not rolling waters, when forests stretched beneath what is now the North Sea, when fishers worked coastal lakes where now fishing quotas and marine protected areas define practice. Doggerland is a memory beneath waves, a reminder that the map we see today is just a snapshot in a long, dynamic history. As global climate change accelerates, we face a new era of rising seas. Coastal communities study Doggerland's drowning for lessons: the importance of adaptive settlement, the viability of raised walkways, the need for sediment management in deltas. We see the costs of letting sea level advance unchecked: farmland saltescored, freshwater lenses intruded by salt, houses collapsing into eroding beaches. The story of Doggerland is our story coasts inexorably retreating under a warming sky, urging us to plan not only for centuries but for millennia. On my last dive over the Paleochannel, I hovered over the flint scatters and imagined Mesolithic hunters exploring a land that, in a few centuries, would be gone forever. I thought of our own future, where hills and valleys near today's waterline may one day lie under a shallow sea. We study Doggerland's slow disappearance to understand our own vulnerability and to remember that land, no matter how solid it seems, can vanish under shifting waters. The North Sea rolled on, indifferent to human concerns, its waves brushing the same buried sands that once carried human footprints. I surfaced from the dive, arms heavy, lungs hungry for air. As I climbed the ladder back onto Proteus, I carried with me more than flint shards or peat cores. I carried the story of a world undone by melting ice, a land reclaimed by water, and a lesson for us all. The ground beneath our feet is not guaranteed. Even the vast plains of Doggerland, once the heart of Europe's earliest coastal societies, lie hidden beneath the waves, and so the sea keeps its secrets longer than land ever will. In the echoes of sonar and the grains of mud in our cores, Doggerland whispers its tale of forests and rivers, of hunters and fishers, of human adaptation and ultimate surrender to nature's tides. Its disappearance reshaped migration, settlement, and culture in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. And in its story we find both warning and wisdom as we chart the uncertain shores of our own future. The morning of September 27, 1998, broke warm and humid over the Outer Banks of Virginia, a string of barrier islands wedged between the Atlantic's rolling surf and the calm waters of the Currituck Sound. Fishermen launched skiffs at dawn, and children splashed in the shallow lagoons. For nearly a week, All eyes on the mainland had watched Hurricane George's tear across the Caribbean and up the east coast, its core veering just east of the hurricane warning line, sparing the Outer Banks a direct hit. Now, its ragged outflow buffeted the dunes with gusts near hurricane strength, clouds boiling overhead, but the worst was believed past. Among the last to leave was Ranger Tom Whitman of the Cape Hatteras National Seashore. He had spent the summer guiding eco-tourists through the maritime forest, pointing out the nests of least terns and the burrows of ghost crabs. With a final sweep of his flashlight, he checked that the ranger station was locked, then drove north along NC-12. The wind picked up, bending power lines into convulsions, rattling the wooden house frames that lined the two-lane road. By midnight, the surge had crested at more than 6 feet. Storm waves pounded the narrow roadway, dunes collapsed under the pounding surf. Whitman pressed on, headlights half swallowed by spray, until he reached the Currituck County line and stopped, stranded on a hill of debris. When dawn came, it revealed a changed world. The inlet at Pea Island Long, a shallow tidal channel carved by winter storm shad, widened to more than 300 meters. Cape Hatteras's signature ridge of sand dunes was breached, a yawning gash where water had rushed through. The carefully maintained NC-12 was severed, the highway lay submerged, the pavement buckled like a broken spine. The Sound side, once placid, surged into Oceanside by giant currents, draining the Sound's water at whirlpools that swallowed trees and docks. Houses built to accommodate tourists in summer now floated unmoored, their pilings snapped. The barrier islands, written in sand by centuries of wind and tide, had rewritten their own outlines in a single night. News helicopters circled overhead, beams scanning the wreckage as resident volunteers formed bucket brigades to bail out flooded cottages. Among them was Clara Johnson, whose family had owned a vacation rental on Pea Island for 3 generations. She waded knee-deep through its salty floods, carrying blankets, canned food, and rubber boots to stranded guests. She knelt by the sliding door of Unit 7, where a tourist family huddled on the couch, bewildered. "It's okay," Clara said as a 4-year-old girl clutched her wrist. "We'll keep you safe until the water goes down. This island moves, but we stand together." By midday, the US Coast Guard had plucked the most vulnerable and transported them to Corolla. State engineers began erecting temporary bridging spans across the new inlet, trucking in rock and steel plates to repair the breach. Satellite images showed the inlet's tributaries slithering across what had been an expanse of sea oats. Geologists rushed to measure how far sand had shifted. They mapped fresh tidal channels and eroded dunes, calculating that more than 1 million cubic meters of sand had been displaced. Over the following months, dredges pumped sand to rebuild dunes, and contractors laid steel grid mats to restore NC-12. Yet, despite these heroic efforts, the barrier islands had asserted their will. Barrier islands are ephemeral, their locations shifting with storms, their shapes fluid as paint smudged by relentless tides. Barrier Island researcher Dr. Marcus League told the local paper, "The Outer Banks are nature's scribble on a blank page. With each large storm, the lines blur and move, and sometimes a whole word disappears." Some residents, like Clara, lamented the loss of familiar landscapes, but others saw renewal. New tidal pools offered habitat for fiddler crabs. Oysters began to settle on newly exposed ribs of sunken trees. The breach at Pea Island, though disruptive, formed a deeper channel that boats could navigate in calm weather, opening access to anglers and eco-tourists. Nature sculpted a new inlet that, given time and gentle management, might become a thriving estuary. Across the globe, nearly 6,000 miles to the south and east, another shoreline found itself at the mercy of great water. On December 26, 2004, an undersea megathrust earthquake off Sumatra's west coast released energy equivalent to more than 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. In minutes, it triggered a series of tsunamis racing across the Indian Ocean at jetliner speeds. Aceh province in northern Indonesia faced the brunt. A wall of water up to 30 meters high smashed into coastal villages with such force that entire groves of coconut trees were snapped like toothpicks. Villagers awoke in darkness, ocean roar filling the air. Layla, a midwife in the fishing hamlet of Lamno, remembers the sudden surge that carried her home inland in seconds. "One moment I was waking, and the next I was climbing the roof to escape," she said years later, voice trembling. "When I reached the top, I saw nothing but a sea of wreckage boats smashed into houses, bodies swirling like flotsam. By dawn, Lamno and neighbouring towns were gone. Wooden houses lay in splinters, their planks tossed in tangled heaps. The land had been scoured down to bare sand, and where mangrove forests once held the tides back, only stumps remained. Layla waded through debris, caring for the injured and comforting those who had lost everything. She buried bodies in mass graves on higher ground, barely conscious of shock and grief. The tsunami's speed 1,200 kilometers per hour in deep water, slowing to a powerful swell near shore allowed little time for escape. Entire islands, once charted and mapped, vanished. Pulau Tunom to the west was split in two. Southern lowlands erased entirely, northern high ground left as an orphan ridge. In some cases, spits of sand that had sheltered boats collapsed overnight, reforming new peninsulas as the first spring tides fell 2 days later. In the harbour of Banda Aceh, dockyards lay under 12 metres of water, and blast furnace ironworks, abandoned since colonial times, disappeared beneath fresh sand. Scientists flew into Banda Aceh in weeks, measuring bathymetry and coastal profiles. Marine geologist Dr. Alan Richards collected core samples from devastated shorelines, finding layers of tsunami sand 2 meters thick over pre-existing beach sediment sown events imprint buried under another. Historical records hinted at similar cataclysms in 1833 and 1907, but none matched the 2004 event scale. Dr. Richards later wrote, "The coastline has been irrevocably altered. What was solid land on December 25 is now part of the seabed. Recovery will require decades of sediment deposition, and human settlements must move back from the new high water line. Local governments erected steel seawalls and planted mangroves as natural buffers, hoping to shield communities from future tsunamis. New building codes mandated stilted houses and designated vertical evacuation structures. Yet the power of the waves that night remained the starkest teacher. No man-made barrier could stand unchanged against the force of a rapidly rising tide." Layla returned to her reconstructed clinic 3 years later, treating mothers and newborns who would never know the old village. She helped map safe, corridor-speedier escape routes to higher ground leading inland 2 kilometers from the new shoreline. Landscaping pockets of fruit-bearing trees on embankments kept soil in place. She taught women to recognize the long calm of the sea as a warning sign of stillness before the next surge. When I visited Lamno in 2010, coconut palms already shaded some new houses set behind the embankment. A leveled park bore memorials listing the names of those lost. Children played among concrete evacuation towers built like pagoda symbols of resilience and remembrance. Yet beneath their laughter lay the memory of a coastline that had been erased in hours. Back in Virginia, I spoke again with Clara Johnson 2 years after Hurricane Georges. Between the two events 7 years apart and 3,000 kilometers of ocean, power of water to reshape land had leapt out. A barrier island gash carved overnight, an entire coast stripped in a tidal wave. She had rebuilt her P Island rental on higher pilings, planting new sand dunes reinforced by sea oats. "We can't stop storms or tsunamis," she said, "but we can learn to build in harmony with movable houses, dunes that can shift, and evacuation plans we practice like fire drills." In her living room, she showed me framed photographs from 1998. The island before the storm, the bare inlet on day 2, the temporary bridge under construction, and finally, a restored dune line thick with vegetation. In another frame hung pictures of Aceh from 2005, rubble lining a once bustling beach, rescue workers wading through mud, and in the final photo, a row of mangroves and young coconut trees marking the new shore. Catastrophic storms and tsunamis carve coastlines, not as a knife to paper, but as a sculptor reshaping clay, swiftly, definitively, and without regard for human ambition. In hours or days, entire communities can be moved from the map of safety into charts of vulnerability. Yet in the years that follow, humanity's ingenuity also resurfaces. Engineers erect sea defenses, planners draw new evacuation routes, ecologists plant protective wetlands, and recovery workers rebuild with lessons from destruction. On a clear autumn afternoon, I stood on the Sanderling Beach access near Buxton, North Carolina, where NC-12 had once ended at a dune line before its rupture. Now the highway coils over a steel bridge lined with bollards and high-strength netting. To my left lay Pea Island Refuge, its trails weaving through maritime forests. To my right, a ribbon of freshly deposited sand beckoned to the surf. The inlet still bore Georges' signature, a permanent scar marking where the sea had rushed through. Pilings for a new bridge gleamed in the sun, and the whine of construction cranes filled the air. Beach nourishment trucks rumbled past, depositing sand to rebuild dunes battered by storms. A sign declared, "Expect periodic closures during storm preparations." In one sense, the inlet had become an amenity and exotic waterway, navigable by kayaks and small craft, but in another, it remained a warning. The islands will move again, and we must adapt once more. In Aceh, a bullet train of fresh sand now stretches between hills of palm, and the highway hugs a new embankment planted thick with vetiver grass. At night, rows of solar-powered lampposts light the shoreline, a testament to recovery in the face of unimaginable loss. But villagers know that the sea will test their resolve again, whether through smaller storms or the reawakening of tsunamigenic faults offshore. Our coastlines, like living organisms, respond to shocks both gradual and sudden. Rising seas carve new estuaries. Human activity can heal or aggravate erosion. Storms and tsunamis deliver pulses of energy that reshape land in hours. Each event leaves behind a new baseline. The high water line is redrawn, habitats shift, communities rebuild on fresh foundations. And each time, we glean fresh lessons in resilience, build back smarter, respect natural buffers, and accept that in the eternal contest between land and sea, permanence is a fleeting illusion. When I left the Outer Banks that autumn, the inlet at Pea Island was already home to herons and egrets fishing its shallow channels. Fishermen navigated its deeper water at high tide. Tourists kayaked through it at sunset. Nature had woven the storm's legacy into a new tapestry, one that balanced chaos with opportunity. And continuing south, in the Gulf of Aceh, I saw children learning to build traditional boats on strong points above the tidal flat. Schools teaching the tsunami song, a chant that describes how the sea behaves before the waves strike. They practice climbing to watchtowers painted bright yellow limb pillars rising above coconut palms so that if the ocean ever retreats with an ominous hiss, they will know to flee uphill. In two distant corners of the world, separated by climate and culture, people had borne witness to water's raw power to shape land. In Virginia and in Aceh, lives were changed in hours, coastlines redesigned in the space of a single tidal cycle. Yet each community found its own way to heal. Dunes replanted, mangroves restored, evacuation towers erected, highways lifted. They demonstrated that while water can carve new passages overnight, humanity's resilience builds bridges and embankments over years. As I boarded my flight home, I reflected on the lessons of those storms. Barrier islands and low-lying coasts are not fixed points on static maps, but shifting edges in a dynamic system. Storms remind us that the most certain things, our beaches, our towns, our familiar dunes, can vanish in the flash of a marine onrushing. And yet, in that vulnerability lies opportunity. To design with nature, to plan for impermanence, to weave flexibility into the fabric of our communities. In the end, the Atlantic waves and the Indian Ocean swells themselves become teachers. They whisper through battered houses, carve new inlets through cozy beaches, and leave behind sand that nurtures dunes, builds up marshes, and promises new beginnings. For every coastline reshaped in hours, there follows a season, a year, a decade of rebuilding, of learning to live with change rather than fight it. And so, whether on the barrier islands of Virginia or the shores of Aceh, there flows the same story. Land is fleeting, water is patient, and those who understand both will endure. The first time I saw the Outer Banks was in the late afternoon light of a cooling summer day, the sun slanting low across the Atlantic and painting the sea oats in gold. I stood on the rusted railing of an aging fishing pier at Rodanthe, North Carolina, watching waves roll in rhythmically, their foam washing over the weathered pilings. Behind me, the dunes rose in gentle arcs, crowned with grasses that danced in the breeze. It was easy to imagine that this was a permanent place, that those dunes, those grasses, that stretch of sand, had stood here for centuries and would stay here for centuries more. I was wrong. I'd come to study how barrier islands, those thin ribbons of sand that shield the mainland from the ocean's full fury, move and change over time. Few people realize that these islands migrate shoreward as currents and storms shunt sand along their lengths. Over generations, the outer banks have shifted eastward, inch by inch, like a giant sine wave marching across the continental shelf. I was here to document that silent migration, to learn how entire landforms can disappear or fuse with the shore without anyone noticing until after the fact. My guide was Dr. Claire Hatcher, a coastal geomorphologist who had spent her career charting North Carolina's barrier islands. She had invited me to join her on a field trip, and now we waded out from the pier through ankle-deep surf, walking toward a row of dunes pocked with wooden walkways. "This spot," she said, pointing inland, "used to be a tombolo connecting Hatteras Island to Bodie Island. My great-grandfather's family built a cottage right where those sea oats grow." I turned to look at the dunes. There, maybe 30 meters back, a weatherboard cottage perched on pilings, its windows facing the sound rather than the sea. "Your great-grandfather's cottage?" I asked. She smiled wryly. "He bought it in 1920, when the islands were farther east. That was prime beachfront property then. But over the decades, the spit migrated, the tombolo was breached by storms, and the cottage ended up stranded on the backside of the dunes, facing Pamlico Sound instead of the Atlantic." We followed her finger to a low notch in the Duneson old washover fan, where waves had once swept inland during a hurricane, gouging a channel that never fully healed. That breach severed the natural link between islands, reshaping local currents and sand transport. Today, hikers walk on either side of it without realizing they pass through a landscape that didn't exist or existed differently just a few decades ago. As we climbed the dunes, Claire explained the process. Alongshore currents driven by prevailing winds move sand up and down the beach in a zigzag pattern called littoral drift. When storms approach from the southeast, they pile sand on one end of an island, only for it to return on calmer days. Over time, the net effect is an island slowly migrating in the direction of the dominant drift. On the outer banks, that drift is south to north in practical terms, east to west when the islands curve. "Barrier islands aren't fixed," she said. "They're dynamic, living landforms. They march across the shelf like armies." At the dune crest, we paused to survey the scene. To the east lay the open Atlantic, its surface mottled with wind ripples. To the west, Pamlico Sound stretched in silver pools. Beyond it rose the mainland, distant and unchanging. Between ocean and mainland stretched the shifting sands. Gilbert Island, formerly a separate spit, now welded to Hatteras Island. P Island, once an independent cay, now a component of the continuous barrier chain. Each had its own history of fragmentation and fusion, as sand moved relentlessly in search of equilibrium. We set up our GPS station next to a weathered sign marking a research plot, 1995 Dune Stabilization Project. Claire and her team had planted sea oats there 30 years ago to anchor the dunes, but I could see the oats were now thickly clustered south of the sign. The GPS log showed that the dune crest had moved nearly 20 meters landward since the New Testament, overwhelmed by natural forces. "We plant vegetation to buy time," Claire said, "but we can't stop the migration. We can only slow it or guide it." That afternoon, we returned to the pier with coring tubes and sediment trap stools to sample the subsurface layers and measure sand transport rates. We paused on the way to examine an old marsh plain exposed at low tide, now covered by a veneer of sand. Beneath our boots lay buried salt marsh peat, radiocarbon dated to the 18th century. In those days, the shore lay much farther east, the tidal flats extended well inland. As barrier islands advanced, they overrode the marsh, leaving behind drowned forest's ghostly stumps that occasionally surface after hurricanes scour the beaches. My first night in Rodanthe, I slept to the sound of surf and dreamt of marching armies of sand, advancing steadily across the channel toward the mainland. In the morning, the temperature reading on my phone had dropped 5 degrees. A cold front had swept through, shifting winds. Claire and I drove north along NC12, passing house after house set on tall pilings, their ground floors left empty except for storage. Many of these homes had been moved inland twice in the last 50 years, lifted by cranes and hauled on flatbeds to avoid encroaching shorelines. Local families paid to protect their investments, erecting seawalls and relocating utility lines, but they knew those measures were expensive and temporary. At Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge, we met Ranger Paul Gaines amid a grove of live oaks whose gnarled trunks told their own story. "These trees are survivors," he said, tapping his finger on a knotted bark. "They grew here after a major overwash in 1933. Sand buried their roots, then settled. They adapted, rose above the dunes, and now protect the marsh behind them. But you can see where the dunes have moved those hollows there used to be behind us. Now the ocean licks our toes at high tide." We walked to the beach, where driftwood logs lay strung like beads along the high water mark. To the south, the sound of surf gave way to a gentle rippling as waves rolled into a now shallow lagoon where hunting blinds once dotted the marsh grasses. A century ago, that lagoon was part of Pamlico Sound's open water. Then barrier islands advanced, choking it off. Today, sand spits bulldoze new lagoons inland, remaking the refuge every hurricane season. That evening, I met local fisherman Carlos Hernandez, whose family had fished these waters for generations. He unloaded a cooler of flounder on the pier, the fish shining silver in the lamplight. He told me how shallow flats where he once netted croaker had turned to mud flats or vanished under dunes. "My father's boat used to reach a channel right here," he said, gesturing to a stretch of wet sand. "Now, he has to motor an extra mile north. The channel moved, the shoals shifted. None of this is new to us. We follow the fish, and the fish follow the bottom." We sat on the edge of the pier and cracked open beers as a lightning storm gathered offshore. Thunder rumbled, and the sky flickered. Carlos laughed and held up his bottle. "On these islands, the ground moves, the water moves, and you learn to roll with eye to get left behind." In the weeks that followed, our sediment traps yielded startling numbers. On average, 200 cubic meters of sand moved alongshore every year in this sector. Yet storms could mobilize that same volume in a single event. In August, Hurricane Isabel passed to the south, kicking up waves that breached dunes and carved overwash fans hundreds of meters inland. We flew our drone over those fans, mapping new channels and sand ridges. Where GPS markers had once stood, we found only sand drifts. Our earlier dune planting work lay buried under feet of sediment. During one field meeting at the Dare County Emergency Management Office, we watched engineers present plans to build a rock revetment along a particularly vulnerable stretch of beach. Local residents split into two camps, those who feared losing their view and their sandy access, and those who worried that without hard infrastructure, storms would wash away roads and homes. In the huddle, Claire cautioned them. Hard structures can starve adjacent beaches of sand, causing down-drift erosion. You may protect one section but doom the next. Across the table, a developer piped up, "We need time to adapt. If we lose this road, we lose our economy." Others countered, "Time's shorter than you think. Without enough sand supply, the island will breach here permanently." The debate laid bare the core tension. Humans strive for stability in a fundamentally unstable environment. That winter, I returned to Rodanthi under a grey sky. The dunes had grown thinner and lower after a series of nor'easters. A freshly carved inlet lay 200 meters north of the one Georges had made in 1998, proof that barrier islands reshape not only during hurricanes but through more frequent winter storms. Walkers on the beach stooped to gather bits of sea glass and spent whelk shells, unaware that they trod where dune grass once swayed knee-high. I spent an afternoon exploring the marsh behind the beach using an airboat. Gliding past ribbed salt marsh grasses, I saw the contrast. To the south, the ocean's roar. To the north, a sheltered lagoon turning to brackish marsh. Underneath, tidal creeks that once flushed fish toward mid-sound were now cut off by new hummocks of sand. Fishers casting lines from small skiffs had to navigate sinuous channels they no longer recognized. My final sunset there found me standing on the dune crest as the sky turned rose and lavender. I watched waves race toward me, breaking in ribboned white lines. I thought of Doggerland washed by rising post-euglacial seas, of Surtsee's newborn cone eaten away by Atlantic storms, of the Indian Ocean tsunami that redrew an entire coastline in hours. Now I knew that barrier islands reflect Earth's dynamic balances and shifting in the perpetual tug-of-war between land and sea. The Outer Banks, I realized, are not relics of a long-ago past, but living, breathing landforms. They migrate, fragment, fuse, and vanish on timescales from months to millennia. Houses can be raised on stilts, roads realigned, ecosystems replanted, but the islands themselves will dance to the current's tune, sometimes inching slowly, sometimes leaping forward in the teeth of a hurricane. When I left the islands that night, I carried with me the hush of dying light and the chorus of crashing surf. I carried the stories of families who moved their homes inland, of ecologists who planted dunes with sea oats, of engineers who debated revetments, and of fishermen who tracked channels that no longer lay where they once did. And I carried the certainty that this shifting world holds lessons for our own future, that no coastline is fixed, that sediment is our currency, and that the land beneath our feet barrier islands, spits, tombolous flows like water itself, reshaping in the ceaseless dance of Earth's restless tides. The Arctic night was retreating when I first set foot on the Beaufort Sea coast. The sun hovered low above the horizon, an orange sliver that never fully rose before dipping again into the horizon. I arrived by Cessna floatplane, skimming across a frozen lagoon before landing on a narrow waterway carved through the snow. My host, Inupiaq subsistence hunter and community elder Mary Tulugak, met me at the shore in her parka and mukluks, her breath steaming in the cold air. "Welcome," she said, her voice steady despite the wind. "But be careful where you step. The ground here is slippery and unstable." She pointed to a jagged cliff face behind USA, pale ribbon of sediment and ice reaching 10 meters from beach to tundra top. "That cliff used to be our yard 5 years ago," she explained. "Now it's all gone." As we climbed carefully onto the bluff, I saw the scars of retreat. Vertical faces freshly carved, their permafrost cores laid bare in milky white ice, mixed with grey clay and anchoring roots of willow and tussock grass hanging helplessly. Beneath, waves lapped at the base, churning sediment into the cold, turbid water. Each wave pounded like a fist, undermining the ice-rich cliffs through a relentless cycle of freeze and thaw, break and wash. I turned to Mary. "How fast is this happening?" She sighed, scanning the horizon. "Up to 10 meters a year, where the wind blows free from the ice. When the sea ice used to freeze in October and hold till May, our coast was safe. Now the ice arrives late and leaves early. The ocean is open longer, and the waves never stop." I remembered the data I'd seen. Arctic sea ice cover had declined by more than 40% in summer compared to the 1980s, shrinking the protective barrier that once calmed the Beaufort's fury. With the ice gone, wind whips across the open water, generating swells that hammer the shoreline day after day. The permafrost soil that remained frozen for millennia thaws in places where the ice's insulating blanket once lay thick. Without that protection, cliffs collapse in huge blocks, creating a shockwave of sediment that further weakens adjacent ground. "Let's walk to where my grandparents lived," Mary said. We followed a narrow spiral track etched into the tundra until it ended at the crest of the bluff. Below, half the schoolyard lay submerged, its rugby goalposts toppled, hilts of hockey sticks jutting from the water like driftwood. A patch of asphalt, what remained of the community, rink-sloped into the waves. Where once a handful of houses perched, there was now only a jagged cliff edge, some pilings poking above the surf like broken teeth. "The school moved inland 3 years ago," she said. "My daughter's kindergarten class is now in a new building behind you, but every time the wind changes, we worry the coast will take the whole neighborhood." We paused at the bluff's edge. Below, chunks of earth floated in the surf, pieces of moss, clods of clay, root mats sheared free by the last high tide. I heard the faint crack of ice expanding in the sun and the hollow thud of waves striking the cliff face. It was a drumbeat of destruction. The next morning, I joined coastal engineer Dr. Simon Haynes on a skiff, skirting just offshore of Mary's village. Simon maneuvered close enough to measure wave heights with his anemometer and run a GPS track along the bluff toe. He spoke into his wind-muffled mic. "Without sea ice, our fetch increases dramatically. Now we record wave heights of up to 2 meters at the base of those cliffs waves that 30 years ago we never saw before September." He pointed to a stretch of shore ahead. That bend used to support a landfill and a community garden. Last fall, a storm surge washed right through it. We lost the garden, and the waste started seeping into the water. They had to haul everything away last winter and start again inland. I felt a pang imagining green wheelbarrows buried beneath the waves. In the Arctic, gardens are not mere ornament. They supply fresh greens in long winters when supermarkets deliver only canned and frozen goods at exorbitant prices. Losing those gardens means losing a vital source of nutrition and cultural resilience. As Simon recorded data, I watched the bluffs carve themselves in slow motion. A sudden slough sent a cascade of ice-rich soil into the sea, small avalanche that rippled the water surface. Simon marked the GPS point with a grim expression. Annual retreat rates here are averaging 7 to 10 meters per year, he reported. If nothing changes, the remaining yards, roads, and even the clinic will be at risk within a decade. We returned to shore and hiked inland, leaving the skiff to spray gulls horsing among the floating debris. On a cleared plateau, we found a weather station perched where the pier once stood. Its instruments recorded air and water temperature, wind speed, and ice cover duration. The station logs showed the freeze update creeping later each year once October, now closer to December, and the breakup advancing from May to early April. Each week of open water equals more wave events. At the community centre that afternoon, I joined a town hall meeting where elders and scientists mingled, discussing adaptation strategies. Local leaders proposed building dune reinforcement with geotextile tube-sand-filled cofferdams that could resist wave overtopping. Engineers sketched plans for a seawall, though the cost would be more than twice the village's annual budget. Others suggested elevating houses on steel pilings. Some elders raised voices about tradition. Homes would no longer sit on ancestral ground. The graveyard, too, needed relocation. One wanted ancestors' resting place to collapse into the sea. Mary stood at the microphone, translated by her grandson. "We cannot stop the ocean," she said calmly. "We must learn to live with the tides. Our stories say that the land wears away like all things. We adapt our lives, our homes, our hearts." She proposed expanding community gardens uphill, building raised platforms for elder gatherings, and reinforcing burial mounds with stone. By evening, as the Arctic sun hovered low, we walked back to the bluff's edge. Beneath the red sky, the permafrost face glowed in soft light, its seams and nodules revealing the complex architecture of frozen ground. Ice layers formed in ancient summers, root tufts cemented in ancient soils, layers of aeolian and fluvial sediments, all vulnerable now to wave undercutting. The roar of the surf was a constant reminder that climate rhythms had changed. No longer a brief storm season, but an extended marine season attacking permafrost shores. In the days that followed, I interviewed families who had moved homes inland. They spoke of watching the first sign of thaw in the spring drips of water dripping from roof eaves and the sight of trickling rivulets where snow had once melted too quickly, revealing slushy ground. They recalled the first house that leaned crooked when its foundation soil washed away. They described the anxiety of winter storms pounding the bluff, driving jagged ice floes into the cliff toe. Each family had a personal chronicle of losses: tool sheds, garden beds, dog houses, picnic tables, little markers of home disappearing in increments until it felt as though the ground itself conspired to erase their roots. Scientists working with indigenous knowledge held mapping workshops, overlaying oral histories of shoreline position with satellite images. I watched as elders traced old shoreline markers, driftwood posts set by ancestors hundreds of years ago, and compared them to modern GIS contours. The maps were sobering, lines shifting inland by dozens of meters, landscapes once full of roots and roots full of meaning becoming seabed. Yet amidst the losses, hope took root. Community members built floating docks with flexible connections, so their boats could still tie up to the shore even when it receded. Others installed gabion baskets filled with rocks to slow erosion locally. Youth groups planted willow cuttings that could help bind soil, experimenting with native plantings that tolerate salinity and wave overtopping. At the school, kids painted murals of the coast, waves meeting ice, polar bears gazing inland, families standing on high ground. The murals declared, "We remember where we came from, even as we move forward." On my final morning, Mary took me to a secluded cove east of town, where a grove of black spruce clung to a low terrace. Bird nests teetered in branches overhanging the water. She picked up a smooth pebble warmed by the sun. "This tree once grew there," she said, pointing across a channel now 15 meters wide. "Grandfather sat here as a boy, looking at the fishing boats. The channel formed in one fierce gale. Everything changes." She handed me the pebble. "Take it as a reminder. What's solid today may be water tomorrow." I stood on the bluff's rim, peering at the tumultuous surf, and felt a sense of bittersweet wonder. Here, on the edge of permafrost tundra, the relentless ocean was carving a new coastline, eroding millennia of frozen soil in mere seasons. This was no slow geological drift, but an accelerated dance of thaw and wavier clash between the planet's rising heat and its vast water. Communities forced greater inland migration every few years, rebuilding their lives further from the sea even as the sea reached ever closer. As I flew away from that coast, the overhead view revealed a patchwork quilt of shifting inlets and crescents of beach migrating shoreward. Ponds and lagoons formed where dunes once stood. On the map, dotted lines marking former shorelines lay hundreds of meters seaward of today's coast. It was a landscape in flux, writing a new story of land and sea. The Beaufort Sea's permafrost cliffs would continue to retreat in meters of land lost each year in some stretches. With Arctic warming accelerating, opener water seasons will lengthen and wave seasons will intensify. Even engineering marvel seawalls of stone, pilings of steel offer only temporary reprieve against millions of square kilometers of ocean. Yet communities, armed with traditional knowledge and modern science, found ways to adapt. Floating docks, flexible foundations, resilient gardens, and relocated schools. They turned retreat into resilience, finding dignity in adaptation rather than despair in loss. That retreating cliff at Rodanthi's cousin community is emblematic of a global challenge. From Alaska to Greenland to Siberia, permafrost-bound coasts everywhere face the same fate. First they freeze, then they thaw, then they break, and then they disappear beneath rising waves. Communities must read the signs-telltale cracks, slumped ground, widening creeksand, decide whether to stay and safeguard their heritage or to relocate and forge a new foothold. And in doing so, they chart a path for the rest of the world, where sea level rise and erosion threaten countless shorelines. Back in my office, I placed Mary's pebble on a wooden shelf over a map of the Beaufort coast. It reminded me that landscapes are not static backdrops but living stories, written and rewritten by ice, water, and human endeavor. Those permafrost cliffs on solid ground now crumble in hours under waves that could not reach them a generation ago. And yet, amidst the disappearing land and forced retreats, people find ways to hold on to place, to build community, and to weave continuity into their ever-reshifting world. In the end, the tale of Alaska's tundra bluffs is not only one of loss, it is also a story of adaptation of families moving homes inland, of scientists mapping change, of traditional knowledge guiding resilience, and of the human heart's tenacity in the face of ceaseless change. It is a testament to our ability to meet nature's challenges not by conquering but by learning, listening, and adapting to the rhythms of a world in motion. Atolls and reef islands depend on healthy coral growth to maintain elevation. Warming seas bleach and kill corals, reducing calcium carbonate production. Tuvalu and the Maldives face the literal sinking of shorelines as older reef materials erode without new reef accretion. Expand this to 2,000 words in narrative form. I first stood on the edge of Jakarta's old railway viaduct just before dawn, the tangle of tracks stretching into the dim haze of streetlights and rice husk smoke. Below me, the empty streets lay glassy with floodwater that had crept in overnight. In places where the railway embankment had dipped, the water lapped gently at the rails. In others, the tracks stood well above the flood, hinting at the months and years when this land lay a full meter higher than it does today. Jakarta's story is written in the soil beneath those rails, a story of compaction, of human ambition, and of the imperceptible sinking of a great city. Here, on the alluvial plains of the Siliwung and Cisadane rivers, layers of sediment once deposited by ancient floods formed a thick carpet of soft clay and peat. It was a city built on water canals for drainage, rivers for transport, and wells tapping the shallow aquifer beneath. But beneath the houses and skyscrapers, that soft ground carried a price. It is easy to pump water from clay and peat, but the ground never quite rebounds to its former height. When the Dutch first laid the foundations of Batavia modern-day Jakarta in the 17th century, they sank wooden piles deep into the clay to support brick warehouses and colonial mansions. The ground seemed stable enough. Canals crisscrossed the town, and pumps moved water at the first hint of inundation. But as the city expanded, so did its thirst for water. By the early 20th century, the population of Batavia had doubled, then tripled, and with each new well drilled, the aquifer beneath fell lower. The bowels of the earth yielded its treasure-fresh water for drinking, irrigation, and industry. But for every litre drawn, the clays and peats compressed, squeezing out previous pore space like a sponge underfoot. I reached into my pocket and pulled out an old pamphlet, a photograph of Jalan Merdeka in the 1930s, its surface so high and dry that pedestrians strolled along wide sidewalks, electric trams rattling along the centre. Compare that to the same vista today, and you see sidewalks submerged by monsoon floods, tram tracks long gone, replaced by a quagmire of potholes and standing water. Each year, the city's elevation drops by several centimetres, some districts sinking as much as 25 centimetres per decade. By mid-21st century projections, half of North Jakarta stands below sea level at high tide. It's not only groundwater pumping that drives this subsidence. Beneath the gleaming towers of the city's business district lie oil wells and gas rigs. In the days after Indonesia's independence, the National Oil Company converted colonial exploration fields into production zones. Extracting hydrocarbons from sand-filled reservoirs, they drew down underground pressure, causing overlying strata to slump. Pumps and pipelines ported the gas and oil to refineries and ports. Each barrel brought money and modern amenities, but also allowed the ground to settle further. The combined effect of groundwater withdrawal and oil extraction is staggering. Satellite measurements show Jakarta's surface lowering at rates unmatched by most other sinking cities. Mexico City, New Orleans, and Bangkok all face subsidence, but Jakarta's rate exceeding 10 centimeters per year in part puts it among the world's fastest sinking metropolises. The government labels the process groundwater-induced land subsidence. Yet for many residents, it feels like a slow slide into oblivion as homes, roads, and canals lose their gradient and become ever more flood-prone. I took a boat through one neighborhood of North Jakarta called Pluit, where the sea had invaded former rice paddies. Here, wooden stilt houses stand in mudflats, accessed by rickety walkways or narrow sampans. From the water, I watched villagers haul garbage into floating bins tied to bamboo poles, then row them to collection points higher up. Children fished for catfish in water that sloshed beneath their huts. Their laughter rose above the gentle lapping, but the hollow note of buoyant degradation haunted the air. This land was supposed to be firm, a place to build a future, yet every monsoon drove the waves across their porches. In 2007, I met a family who had lived in Pluit for 3 generations. Grandfather had built their home on fill dredged from a nearby canal sand, and clay heaped to raise the ground above tidal marsh. Father had deepened the foundation, driving pilings as the land sank further. And now, Mother said, they watched as the garden flooded months longer each year, as the canal's embankment eroded under boat wash, and as the walls showed cracks from flexing soils. These people were not refugees of war or violence. They were climate refugees of a different sort, displaced by their own city's thirst, by the extraction of underground resources, and by the rise of oceans threatening to reclaim the land. Jakarta's flooding is both tidal and fluvial. I visited the floodgates along the East Flood Canal, a massive concrete channel built after the disastrous floods of 2002 that inundated a third of the city. The gates were meant to control river surges and monsoon deluge, but subsidence has left them less effective. The control basins lie below the surrounding ground level, so water backs up into neighborhoods instead of flowing out to sea. Pumps sit idle when power fails, leaving neighborhoods ankle-deep in brackish water for days. Each flood carries salt that seeps into the soil, corroding foundations and making agriculture nearly impossible. Urban development compounds the problem. High-rise condominiums and shopping malls spring up on land reclaimed from tidal flats, often without proper geotechnical surveying or soil stabilization. Developers pour concrete slabs over compacted fill, then erect towers whose weight further compresses the underlying strata. Roads and expressways crisscross the city, sealed by asphalt that prevents natural infiltration, forcing stormwater to pond against sunken curbs. The drainage networks, unable to maintain gravity flow, rely on pumps that themselves are grounded in land losing height every year. From a helicopter, I once watched a neighborhood called Kelapa Gading slowly drown. Decades ago, Netherlands-style canals were dug, divided by neat rows of houses and tree-lined boulevards. But the ground had sunk unevenly, leaving some streets well below canal level. At the first sign of heavy rain, water oozed onto roadways, pooling until vehicles could not pass. Residents installed electric pump stations at their porches, hundreds of small waterworks struggling to keep floodwaters at bay. People joked that if the power went off, they would literally swim to work. But behind the humor lay a grim reality. The city's bedrock was no longer reassuring, and their resilience came at the cost of daily vigilance. Jakarta's plight reached a tipping point in 2013, when a record-breaking downpour overwhelmed both natural and engineered drainage. 3 million people were displaced, and over 1,000 displaced Jakarta badly. In a desperate scramble, the military airlifted sandbags and armored vehicles patrolled flooded boulevards. Government leaders declared unprecedented conditions, but for many residents it was simply the latest in a series of floods, each deeper, each more urgent, each more impossible to ignore. That year, I interviewed Mayor Basuki Tjahaja known as a Hoke in his office, overlooking a sea of floodwaters beyond the palace walls. He spoke of plans to build a giant seawall and to canalize rivers. But, he said, without addressing subsidence, without regulating groundwater extraction and offsetting oil production, the seawall would stand on shifting sands. We must reduce pumping, enforce regulations, and consider importing water from outer islands, he said. Otherwise, we are merely patching a sinking boat. His words carried weight, but the challenge was immense. Jakarta sits on a sacred delta, where the Ciliwung, Krukut and Kakung rivers meet before spilling into Jakarta Bay. The delta is a web of waterways, wetlands, and reclaimed landons home to swamps, forests and pangolins. As settlers built dikes and drained rice fields, they replaced wetland resilience with monocultures and flood risk. Then, as the city boomed, even more land was filled for development, tipping the balance toward a brittle urban delta that could not absorb stormwater or buffer tidal surges without natural buffers. International experts recommended managed aquifer recharge, injecting treated water back into the depleted aquifer to slow subsidence. They advised switching from groundwater to piped river water or desalination. They pressed for stringent controls on well drilling and for closing old oil fields. But each solution faced social and economic hurdles. Piped water networks required massive investment, desalination was costly, regulatory enforcement clashed with powerful vested interests, and oil revenues fueled national budgets. In the face of these obstacles, Jakarta's residents improvised. In North Jakarta's sunken slums, residents built floating houses on pontoons, adapting to chronic flooding by embracing water rather than fighting it. These kampungs air-corrected dwellings for life on the waves. In the middle of the city, a community garden project planted water-tolerant crops in raised beds, harvesting spinach and sorrel in soils that might lie half a meter below floodwater only hours after planting. At a tech incubator, young engineers designed sensors that measure ground tilt and vibration, alerting city managers to critical subsidence hotspots. Perhaps the most radical adaptation came with the new Indonesian capital plan, announced in 2019, moving the seat of government from sinking Jakarta to a site in East Kalimantan on Borneo. The move recognized that Jakarta's long-term habitability faced severe threats from subsidence, sea level rise, and flood risk. It sparked debate. Could the metropolis be saved by engineering, or was relocation the only viable path? On my last visit to Jakarta, I stood at the old Shoreline Museum near Kota Tua, where a faded line on the plaza marked the 1,970 coastline. Behind me, Jakarta Bay lapped at a modern port development 30 meters seaward of that line. Ahead, traffic choked narrow streets that once formed the bustling heart of Dutch Batavia. Everywhere, the city bore the imprint of subsidence. Twisted lampposts, flooded underpasses, foundations needing constant pumping to stay dry. My guide, urban planner Anita Wijaja, leaned on the old museum wall. "Jakarta is the canary in the coal mine," she said. "We built on clay and peat, we pumped too much water, we exploited our underground wealth, and now we sink. Cities around the world will follow unless they heed our fate." Her words lingered as I gazed at a view I had seen through centuries, from rattan huts beside tidal flats to colonial brick warehouses, to gleaming skyscrapers straddling canals, to sunken roads hemmed by floodgates. The city had always been defined by water, its lifeblood and its grave. Jakarta's excess led to subsidence. Its subsidence forced it to confront its own destiny, adapt in place or move elsewhere. The soil beneath slipped under each careful footstep, a humbling reminder that beneath civilization's progress lies a deeper, substrate fragile, compressible, and ever susceptible to human misuse. As I flew out of Soekarno-Hatta Airport that afternoon, I looked down at the vast spread of urban sprawl. The delta lay in muted green and grey patterns, parks, canals, neighborhoods. No map can fully express the dynamic dance between land and sea below. But I carried with me the lessons of excessive groundwater withdrawal, of oil drilling under city streets, of masked subsidence, and of a city's determination to survive on sinking grounds. Jakarta's story is far from over. Its future will be written by the balance it strikes between extraction and recharge, between concrete and canal, between standing still and moving forward. And each time a flood recedes, revealing rooftops dusted with silt, every resident knows that beneath their feet, the city continues to sink, and yet still, they build, they adapt, and they dream on the delta's soft bed. The ramshackle ferryman's boat pitched gently on the silty waters of the Sundarbans when I first met Professor Arif Chowdhury. He stood at the bow, peering through binoculars at a maze of mangrove islands half submerged in tidal grooves. "This delta," he said, voice booming over the hum of the outboard motor, "is a living thing more alive than any forest you've known." We had come to witness island birth and death in real time. Below us, the tide was ebbing, exposing channels carved overnight by the morning's cyclonic swells. Each channel told a story of water's power to sculpt, divide, and reconstruct deltaic land. In this place, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna rivers converge, carrying sediment from the Himalayas and depositing it at the bay's mouth. Over centuries, those sediments built the largest tidal mangrove forest on Earth, a labyrinthine delta, whose islands rise and fall with each monsoon, each cyclone, each deltaic pulse. Professor Chowdhury guided the boat toward a bulbous lump of green that had been, 10 years before, 2 separate islands. He pointed to a narrow neck of mudflats now splitting the landmass. That channel opened in 2009 when Cyclone Ayla struck. The embankment gave way, and seawater surged in. In a single night, half of Dublachar Island vanished beneath the waves. He swept his arm across the horizon where another cluster of islets huddled like castaways. In the delta, land is provisional. It is not home until you've planted your trees and waited through at least one monsoon. We drifted past stands of Sonoratia and Avicennia, their twisted roots clutching at soft mud. Fishermen in canoes pushed off from the shore, nets trailing behind them. The mangroves formed a living breakwater, trapping silt in their tangled roots and building land from the bed. But where the roots fell, silent where embankments failed, or channels shifted, the delta conceded ground to the sea. As we glided upriver into the heart of the Sundarbans, the boat's wake glossed over a field of floating water hyacinths. Here, I spoke with Salma Begum, a 4th-generation farmer whose rice paddies teetered on the edge of oblivion. She led me through a breach in the embankment where seawater had inundated her fields. "My grandmother told me this land was born from silt," she said, wiping mud from her hands. "She built her homestead on a tiny ridge above the mudflats. I thought I inherited the land, but half of my fields washed away when the embankment broke in 2015. Salma showed me the remnants of her dike-scrumbled clay walls that once held back the tide. The banks were sheared clean like a broken jaw, and mangrove poles stood thrust into the water, propping up a hastily rebuilt levee. "We repair what we can," she said, "but the water always returns." I watched her row away, leaving behind furrows of failed farmland. Then Professor Chowdhury invited me to join him on a riverboat bound north, to the mouth of the Meghna, where the sediment load was heaviest. As dusk fell, the sky washed pink and gold, and I saw the delta's contours not on maps but in the glow of lanterns along the shore. Each light marked a village perched on a recent island, an artisan's camp by a new channel, or a fishing hut on an uprooted trunk. Our small flotilla threaded through shifting channels, each bend a new surprise. The riverbank on one side rose in a cliff of layered silt, a pellicle of mud, sand, and peat deposited in the last decade. On the other side lay a mudflat wide enough to harvest shellfish at low tide. The river had migrated half a kilometre in 15 years, a Vulcan event that left behind a swath of abandoned fields and carried the main channel toward new villages. We camped on an embankment of sticks reinforced with geotextile, the government's attempt to hold back the tides. In the flickering firelight, I spoke with Dr. Aisha Patel, a geomorphologist who analyzed the delta's evolving topography with satellite imagery. "Watch," she said, projecting her laptop onto a tarp. Images from the 1980s showed a continuous land bridge. By the 2000s, it fractured into 3 islands, and by the 2010s, dozens of islets floated where there had once been green fields. The delta grows seaward, but it also reorganizes, creating new islands while others sink or are washed away. It's the balance between sediment supply and erosion, and climate change is tipping that balance. She showed me projections. Rising sea levels would drown low-lying mudflats faster than new silt could arrive. Cyclones would carve deeper channels and widen inlets. In a century, some islands that supported tens of thousands of people might vanish for good, while new shoals would rise offshore. The only constant, Hevetes, Dr. Patel said, is change itself. That night, I dreamed of deltaic land, chunky globs of sediment floating on a sea of possibility. In the dreams, I waded across newly formed levees into fields that would be washed away by monsoon floods. I planted rice in soil that had years to settle, only to wake to the knowledge that the next tide would erode those ploughed rows. Deltaic islands are nature's most ephemeral ground, each island a word in a sentence that the sea edits without mercy. When I returned to the United States, I joined a riverboat cruise down the Mississippi Delta. New Orleans lay behind levees and flood walls, its French Quarter elevated on a ridge of Pleistocene sand. But below us, toward the Gulf, lay the labyrinth of bayous and barrier islands, once teeming with coastal marsh and cypress forests. The river's silt fan had built thousands of square kilometers of delta, but levees channeled the river straight out to sea, bypassing the natural crevasse channels that once distributed sediment to the wetlands. The result: subsidence and retreat. On deck, I spoke with pilot Captain Marcus Dubois, whose family has guided ships along the delta for 4 generations. He pointed to a cluster of Barrier Island, Chandeleur, Breton, Grand Terre eroded to broken ridges. They were once 20 kilometers wide, he said. In Katrina, those islands took the brunt of the storm's force. They lost half their width in a night. They're meant to protect the mainland, but with no new sediment, they're graves of sand. We passed oil rigs pierced into mudflats, long pipelines snaking through bayou water, and saltwater marsh reduced to open water. Captain Dubois pulled out historic charts from the 1920s, overlaying them on modern GPS maps. Look here. Bayou La Loutre used to connect to marshlands lost in the 1930s. We've lost hundreds of kilometers of wetlands and they won't come back unless we let the river spread its silt again. He described the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion and Engineering Project to breach levees and send controlled pulses of sediment into sinking marsh. It was a gesture toward deltaic renewal, yet one heavily contested by communities fearing saltwater intrusion and flooded farmland. "We think in concrete and steel," he lamented. "We build walls to keep water out, but the delta builds land by letting water in. We must embrace that cycle if we want to survive." Back in the Sundarbans, I returned to the cyclone-damaged islands to witness the reconstruction. In 2007, Cyclone Sidr had slammed ashore with 15-meter storm surges, erasing entire villages. I spoke with volunteers from a local NGO who had helped rebuild embankments with bamboo frames and rice husk-filled geobags. They planted new mangroves along the bank's mangroves that would trap silt with every tide and soften the waves of the next storm. They taught villagers to cultivate salinity-tolerant rice in raised beds, to dig fish ponds where drained channels once lay, and to diversify livelihoods so they could turn to honey and crab farming when rice fields failed. One evening, as fire lanterns swayed in the wind, I met a boat builder named Karim Hossein. He had crafted his latest catamaran from teak logs salvaged after a tree-throwing flood. He shaped the hull to ride shallow waters and cut cargo holds sized for rice and fish crates. "My father taught me to build boats for the rivers," he said. "But now I build boats for the storm. When the cyclone comes, we load families and livestock aboard. We ride the tides until the storm passes. Then we come back and build again." In the Sundarbans and the Mississippi Delta, I saw deltaic survival not as passive endurance but as active engagement with shifting landscapes. People rebuild homes on piles, repair embankments with living roots, craft boats to float above floods, and shape gardens to thrive in brackish soils. They navigate a world born of silt and sea, a place where land is both gift and impermanent, where new islands emerge offshore even as old ones wash away. On my last morning in the Sundarbans, I watched the tide surge through an old breach repaired with mangrove poles. Mud and silt swirled in the channel, bearing seeds that would germinate on the ebb tide. Professor Chowdhury tapped the water with his oar. "You see," he said, "the delta lives in the pulse. Annual monsoons bring new silt, and storms carve new channels. Islands die. Islands are born. We live here not despite change, but because change gives us this land in the first place." As I floated through the ever-shifting delta, I realized that its story is not one of loss alone, but of renewal. The Sundarbans and the Mississippi share a fate. Deltaic land builds itself by surrendering to water's embrace. The tune is the same in Ganges and Brahmaputra, in Atchafalaya and Wax Lake, in the Congo and the Nile. Rivers carry silt, seas sculpt channels, islands coalesce and dissolve. To live on a deltaic island is to learn its rhythm stow harvests silt and build with it, to plant mangroves that guard against waves, to stay nimble in the face of breaching storms. And so I left the Sundarbans with sand between my toes and promise in my heart that deltaic people will endure as long as they read the currents, heed the tides, and plant their roots in the only ground that truly belongs to them, ground that slips beneath their feet and reforms beneath the next high tide. I first encountered the power of mangroves on a narrow spit of land between the Gulf of Thailand and a bustling shrimp farm. The plantation's ponds lay empty and cracked now, but where the mangrove stand once grew, tall, stilt-rooted trees braced against the tides, their tangled networks cradling fine silt and calming the restless waves. Just beyond, the shoreline stood firm, but where pond levees bit into the forest, the soil fell away into the sea, leaving sheer drops of clay and sand. I watched as a single wavino, larger than a man, swirled at the base of an exposed bank and pulled it down, grain by grain, until the earth surrendered with a low rumble. That afternoon, I walked into the abandoned shrimp ponds, following a narrow boardwalk that threaded between broken dikes and knee-deep pools, felt the air heavy with salt and decay. In its place, I imagined a lush forest where the canopies of Rhizophora and Avicennia once filtered sunlight into a green dusk, where fiddler crabs scuttled between prop roots and mudskippers hopped across the surface. I met a local woman named Suda, who remembered wading here as a child, gathering firewood and crab eggs among leaves and thorns. When the company came, they cut the trees, sold the wood, then dug ponds for shrimp. "It was quick money," she said, voice flat. "We lived off that for a few years, and then the land gave way." Suda pointed toward where her grandmother's rice paddies had once met the forest edge. Now, nothing remained but a shallow bay dotted with dead stumps. Seawater lapped the toes of her small bungalow perched on stilts that had grown taller with each subsidence. Storm surges forced her to raise her front steps every monsoon. Sand and clay stirred with each wave until one day her yard simply vanished. "We had no idea the mangroves did so much," she said, as if realizing the climate had changed without her invitation. "Now we see the error, but can we afford to stop it?" Farther east, I visited a village on the Mekong Delta where reforestation had reversed decades of loss. There, embankments bristled not with concrete but with young saplings of Rhizophora apiculata, their roots clasping the world below like fingers. Within 2 years, mudflats had reappeared at low tide soft, silty expanses where herons stalked mudskippers and fishermen harvested shellfish in wooden punts. I watched a schoolteacher, Mr. Playson, Fan, lead his students through newly planted mangrove lanes, explaining how the roots slow water, drop sediment, and build land. In my childhood, he told me, the Gulf rolled right up to our village. Now, thanks to these trees, our children can walk to school without wading through water. He cupped his hands to show how fish larvae hide among prop roots, growing safe from predators until they swim out to deeper channels. The contrast between these two places sown, stripped of its forest, the other reborn by it, drove home a universal truth. Mangroves are the delta's first defense. Where they stand, waves spend their energy. Where they fall, waves gnaw the coast. In the Bay of Bengal's Sundarbans, I joined patrol boats tracing the edge of the world's largest mangrove forest. There, vast estuaries weave between islands of trees whose roots arrest swirling tides. Royal Bengal tigers stalk through the undergrowth. Spotted deer feed on tender shoots. Each year, enough sediment arrives on the tides to keep the forest's floor buoyant with life, unless cyclones breach the embankments or upstream dams starve the river of silt. In areas where embankments collapsed during Cyclone Ayla, entire islands vanished in a single night, swallowed by the surge that mangroves would have dampened. In these deltaic landscapes, the relationship between human and tree is symbiotic. Coastal communities plant mangroves not only as a buffer against storms, but as nurseries for fish, clams, and crabs, their staple protein. The trees filter out pollutants, bind heavy metals in their leaves and bark, and enrich the mud with organic matter as leaves fall and roots breathe oxygen into the soil. They also sequester carbon each hectare, holding as much carbon underground as a hectare of upland rainforest above. In a world seeking solutions to climate change, mangroves stand as a triple win: land building, community protection, and carbon capture. Yet globally we lose them at an alarming rate, up to 1% per year, faster than any other forest type. Satellite imagery shows jagged patterns of coastal clearings in Southeast Asia, where thousands of square kilometers have been converted to shrimp, palm oil, and real estate. In Indonesia, more than half of the original mangrove cover is gone, replaced by brackish water ponds and open water. In the Florida Everglades, development and engineering channels have disconnected rivers from their floodplains, turning lush fringe forests into dying skeletons. Where I once kayaked beneath green vaults of mangrove branches, now sunlight shone on bare pilings. Alarmed by these losses, a growing number of restoration projects have sprung up. In Vietnam's Can Gio district, just outside Ho Chi Minh City, 1 million seedlings have been planted since the 1990s, growing into a 75-0-hectare reserve where saltwater crocodiles bask on sandy banks. Locals harvest honey from mangrove blooms and veneer wood for carving. Eco-tourists glide along boardwalks through tangerine sunsets refracted on calm waters. The success there inspired similar efforts in Odisha, India, where chronically eroded shores have been stabilized by sown saplings. And in Belize, communities grow rhizophora in nurseries, then transplant them along coastlines battered by hurricanes. These projects share common threads: local engagement, robust nurseries, careful site selection, and species diversity. Single-species plantings often fail, as monocultures are vulnerable to disease and storms. Successful reforestation mimics natural assemblages of Eisenia at the front, then Rhizophora, then Soneratia behind each species, carving its niche in the tidal gradient. Communities learn to monitor salinity, manage crab grazing, and protect new stands from rusting prongs of shrimp farm fences. Over decades, the saplings mature into forests that stand against Typhoon Haiyan, force winds in the Philippines, and Category 5 cyclones in Bangladesh, matching the protective power of concrete seawalls at a fraction of the cost. I watched one such initiative unfold on Loreto, a small coastal village in northern Madagascar. There, villagers had planted mangroves along an eroded beachfront to protect their rice paddies and homes. At first, nothing happened. Seedlings wilted in the salty spray, crab burrows toppled wooden stakes, pigs trampled young shoots. But leaders persisted, rebuilding dikes of coconut fronds to calm waves, installing temporary fences to keep animals out, and watering saplings at low tide. Within 5 years, the roots had taken hold. By the time I visited, children built tree hammocks amid a canopy of red prop roots and feathery leaves. The shoreline had advanced by tens of meters, and fishers found new inlets teeming with luderick and mullet. That morning I joined the chief fisherman, Andrew, as he paddled out to his nets. He pointed to a sandbar that had emerged near the reef crest. "That was mudflat last year," he said. "Now it is island. Soon we will plant more trees there, more land, more fish, more safety." His small wooden skiff bobbed in the swell, the mangrove islands behind him rising like emerald sentinels against a turquoise bay. As he spoke, I felt the oscillation of hope and humility. Nature's restoration is not free but requires patience, labor, and partnership. On my last day in Loreto, we held a tree planting ceremony. Women in bright cloth pressed rice cakes into the mud as a blessing. Children chanted songs for the young trees, and elders told stories of how their ancestors navigated mangrove labyrinths by star maps and tidal cues. At sunset, the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze mingled with distant bird callsabices, kingfishers, and the nocturnal cries of owls gathering on high branches. It was a living cathedral, a testament to what a few hands can rebuild when given time. Back in the shrimp farm-scarred coast of Thailand, years later, I returned to find a different scene. A small NGO had worked with villagers to fill abandoned ponds with mud and plant mangrove poles. The water was calmer, and sand began to settle on the pond edges. Small islands of saplings dotted the horizon. A few fishermen who once rowed through open water now paddled through a corridor of green, and farmers reclaimed plots behind the trees, growing nipper palms on higher ground. They told me stories of birds returning egrets, herons, kingfisher sound of catches improving as juvenile fish found nursery grounds. Mangroves, once removed for short-term gain, could return in a cycle of renewal. So long as communities saw value in muddy roots and tangled limbs, so long as they protected the seedlings and managed adjacent land uses, mangroves could reclaim coastlines and communities could reclaim resilience. The delta and the sea wean us on flux, on transitions, on boundaries that ebb and flow. Within that flux, mangroves stand as boundary guardians, weaving land from water and defense from chaos. On my final sunset in Southeast Asia, I stood on a wooden jetty beside the new mangrove grove. The air was thick with salt and bird calls, the horizon a flat line of green and blue. I closed my eyes and listened, the hush of wavelets against prop roots, the creak of branches in the breeze, the distant hum of cicadas in the canopy. I felt the sediment settle beneath my boots, felt the river's pulse shifting the earth beneath. And I understood that mangroves are more than trees. They are living architecture walls of roots and trunks that trap sand, buffer storms, nurture fish, sequester carbon, and cradle communities in their arms. Wherever they are removed, the coast retreats. Wherever they are replanted, the coast returns. Even small islands rise from mud. Mangroves taught me a fundamental lesson. In nature's logic, stability is built on flexibility and strength on rooted connection. As I left that jetty and climbed into a waiting boat, I carried the sound of rustling leaves and the knowledge that some forests, once lost, can grow again guided by human perseverance and nature's benevolence. And behind me, the mangroves stood sentinel, their roots weaving land from silt, their branches whispering of boundaries that heal themselves, given time, patience, and care. The first time I slipped beneath the surface off Turkey's Datça Peninsula, I felt as though I were crossing a threshold into another world, one both familiar and impossibly alien. Above me, the late afternoon sun shimmered on aquamarine waves. Below, I hovered in a hush of turquoise, watching schools of damselfish weave among swaying seagrass. Then the seabed dropped away, revealing stone blocks and column drums scattered like chess pieces. Greco-Roman settlement drowned beneath 3 meters of water. Our expedition, led by Dr. Leila Koka, had come to chart the submerged ruins of ancient Knidos, a city famed for its temple of Aphrodite and its school of geometry. Sailing past olive groves and perfume-scented myrtle, we had followed medieval maps noting stones in the sea. By the time we anchored, the air was thick with expectation. In the boat's shadow, our ROV's downward lights picked out a network of walls, sidewalks, and mosaic floors, preserved in the silt like frescoes in a sunken chapel. I removed my snorkel and slipped beneath the guardrail. The water embraced me with cool clarity. "Doctor," Coca signaled from above a series of pointed gestures, and I finned toward a flattened courtyard where an arched gateway once stood. Mortar joints glowed pale against the basalt blocks, and fish sheltered in the nooks and crannies. I felt the weight of history in that silent courtyard. Centuries of footsteps, prayers, music, now paused beneath waves that told a story of slow change. Back in the boat, we pored over the first day's footage. Limestone staircases led to what must have been a small temple, its steps now carpeted with jewel-green algae. To the east lay a row of column drums, half-buried, their fluting intact. We catalogued each fragment, capitals, inscribed blocks, fragments of amphorae. The finds pointed to a civic complex dating to the late Hellenistic period around the 1st century BCE, followed by Roman renovations in the 2nd century CE. How had such a grand city come to lie beneath 3 meters of water? Early settlers on the Datsa Peninsula had chosen a hilltop overlooking the sea for its defensive vantage. Over centuries, the harbour silted up and became a lagoon. Then, in a clutch of earthquakes dated by coral uplift and archival records, the land had subsided and the lagoon reflooded, reclaiming its ancient harbour. Sea level rise over the millennia added another half-meter. What remained was a landscape suspended between earth and sea, where sailors once tied their triremes now drifted among olive trees whose trunks rose from sandy shallows. Day 2 found us donning full scuba gear for a close-up survey. I descended beside Dr. Coca and her student Ali, following a line of numbered buoys across a mosaic pavement. Tiny tesseretta quoys, ochre, and black-formed geometric patterns of interlocking swirls. The design's precision hinted at imperial patronage, perhaps a public bath or a marketplace floor. Ali gently swept silt away with a soft brush, revealing an inscription in Greek, Koinon Knidioton, the League of Knidians. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the chipped edges of marble beneath the slurry of suspended sediment. Later, in the evening glow, we reconvened on deck. Freshwater showers rinsed us of salt and silt, while technicians loaded video stills onto laptops. The maps grew thicker. Porticos here, a road lined with column bases there, and beyond, a sunken temple whose podium blocks lay in neat rows, as though waiting for priests to return. We speculated on how the city functioned, a hub of trade linking roads to Alexandria, a beacon of Hellenic learning, a magnet for Roman travelers seeking sun and sea. The submerged ruins painted a picture of a thriving port, erased by slow calamity and preserved by the brine's oxygen-poor grip. That night, I lay on a bunk in our converted fishing boat, listening to the hull creak as the tide rose. I dreamed of ancient citizens going about their days, merchants haggling over amphorae, philosophers teaching under stoic colonnades, worshippers performing rites to Aphrodite's statue. Then I saw the ground shake, walls crumbling, harbour channels flooding, people fleeing uphill as salt water crept through the forum. When I awoke, dawn light burned through the porthole, and I knew I would dive again. On day 3, we deployed grounder-penetrating sonar along a transect where ancient texts suggested a theatre once perched above cliffs. The sonar's chirps returned echoes of terraced seating concentric arcs submerged in mud. Scuba divers followed, descending to uncover wedge-shaped stones that slotted together to form seats. The theatre's backdrop, carved directly from bedrock, still bore traces of plaster and pigmenta-faded blush, suggesting it had been painted. As I ran my gloved hand along a seat's top, I could see the grooves worn by sandals, the faint smudges where performers had paced in the past. Our finds prompted fierce debate. Some argued for conservation in situ, leaving the ruins untouched and protected by designated maritime zones. Others pressed for excavation, raising blocks to museums for public display. UNESCO observers reminded us that disturbance can accelerate decay as underwater currents and biofouling attack newly exposed stone. We charted a compromise. Detailed digital documentation photogrammetry, laser scanning, and 3D model scalpeled with targeted recovery of fragile objects prone to loss, such as inscribed marble and encaustic tiles. Midday heat drove the ROV deeper, down a submerged slope where columns lay collapsed in jumbled heaps. The machine's robotic arms probed for statues and stelae, carefully lifting them into a cradle for ascent. Once on deck, we found what Dr. Coca called the crown jewel, a carved relief fragment showing figures in togas, grapes and ivy enhance a Dionysian scene, celebrating the vineyard cults popular among Roman elites. Even underwater, the relief's classical artistry shone through, a reminder that human creativity can outlast earthquakes and subsidence. At sunset, we held a small lab session beneath a tarpaulin. Under task lights, students rinsed potashard fragments, identifying stamps and maker marks. They pieced together vessels from broken amphorae, reconstructing trade patterns: olive oil from Bithynia, wine from Thasos, garum from Gades. Each shard told a tale of commerce and cultural exchange, linking Knidos's underwater streets with markets around the Mediterranean. Over those days, the site revealed layers of history. Hellenistic foundations laid in the shadow of Alexander's conquests, Roman expansions under Augustus and Trajan, early Byzantine renovations before the city declined in late antiquity, and ultimately seismic subsidence and eustatic sea level rise burying all beneath waves. After a millennium of erosion and deposition, the ruins lay preserved in silt, awaiting rediscovery by modern divers. On our final dive, I found myself floating above a narrow alley lined with raised sidewalks, limestone blocks set like stepping stones above cobbles. Tiny fish flitted through arched doorways leading to submerged shops. Moss and kelp adorned the threshold where merchants once chased away cats and yawning doors. I swam down the alley, turning each corner with a thrill of déjà vu. Was I walking back in time or forward into the future of the past? Back on deck, Dr. Coker raised a toast of local raki in plastic cups, celebrating our successful season. She spoke of next year's plans: to extend the mapping northward, to recover more inscriptions, and to collaborate with Turkish museums on conservation. She emphasized that Knidos was just one of many sunken settlements worldwide, from Pavlopetri off Greece's Peloponnese to Heraklion off Egypt's Alexandria. Each site testified to the slow dance between land and sea where earthquakes, rivers, and climate conspire to raise or sink the ground, burying human footprints beneath waves that preserve them like amber. That night, I walked the village's narrow lanes, now reclaimed from the ancient harbour. Whitewashed houses climbed the hill, olive trees in courtyards, cats weaving between doors. The air smelled of thyme and grilled fish. I stopped at a cafe overlooking the sea's edge, where a sign advertised underwater ruins tours. Tourists paddled over points where columns rose in shallows. I thought of the submerged theatre, the mosaic courtyard, the Dionysian relief hall waiting just below the surface for ears attuned to the sea's hush. As I prepared to leave Datsa at dawn, I climbed once more onto the boat. The lights of Knidos sparkled like distant stars beneath the waves. Even now, echoes of sandals on stone, voices chanting in basilicas, and laughter in open-air theatres lingered in the water's flow. The city, once mighty, then silent, now rediscovered, reminded me that coastlines are not fixed borders but thresholds between human ambition and nature's caprice. In the months that followed, I shared our findings in lectures and publications. I showed images of column drums rising from algae, of mosaics mirrored in dark water, and of inscription fragments steadfast in the silt. I urged colleagues to consider the impact of sea level rise on archaeological heritage. Each meter of rise could inundate thousands of coastal sites, preserving them only in marine archives. I called for collaborative efforts among archaeologists, geologists, and climate scientists to map sunken landscapes before they slip below reach. Off Turkey's Datsa Peninsula, Greco-Roman ruins lie beneath 3 meters of water, a submerged testament to city and sea. Their story speaks to the long and gradual Forceslo subsidence, seismic shaking, eustatic tides that can erase cities from maps while trapping their memory in stone. In the hush beneath waves, human footprints endure, waiting for us to dive carefully, to listen deeply, and to preserve the fragile bridge between past and present buried beneath the blue. I first heard the story of Kumari Kandam on a moonlit night in a coastal village in Tamil Nadu. The fishermen's huts glowed with oil lamps, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and wood smoke. An elderly man called Kannan, his silver hair tied back in a loose bun, beckoned me closer. "They say our ancestors walked to Sri Lanka on dry land," he whispered, voice low as the surf beyond the sand dunes. "Then the ocean swallowed it all, and only those who could swim survived." Cannon's tale was one among many across the Indian Ocean rim legends of a great continent lost beneath the waves, of temples and cities drowned, of ancestors tragically separated from their homeland. Kumari Kandam, they called it, the cradle of our civilization, a landmass said to stretch south from present-day Kanyakumari, connecting Tamil lands to Madagascar, Australia, perhaps even Antarctica. Geologists scoffed at continental drift theories, but for coastal villagers, the memory felt as real as the tide. Weeks later, I stepped onto the rocky shore at Land's End in Cornwall, where the Atlantic's pounding surf had carved cliffs over millennia. A local named Eileen met me beside a weathered sign. "Site of Lyonesse," it read, borrowing a name from Arthurian romance. "They say this was the land of Tristan and Isolde." Eileen told me, her eyes scanning the horizon. The bay used to be farmland. People said they saw church spires at low tide until the Great Flood in the 6th century. She traced the coastline with her finger. Some nights, fishermen hear church bells beneath the waves. Legends of Atlantisof, an island empire lost in one day and night, were almost archetypal. Plato's Platonic dialogue spoke of an advanced civilization swallowed by earthquakes and floods. For centuries, explorers sought its ruins in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, even under the Sahara. Many dismissed it as allegory, yet for coastal communities around the world, the notion of land vanishing beneath the waves was not fantasy but lived experience. In the Pacific, those experiences were embedded in living memory. I found myself in the low-lying atoll of Tuvalu, where the lagoon was never more than a stone's throw from every yard. Elders recounted how their grandparents farmed taro on what is now water, how children swam in freshwater marshes that long ago flooded with salt. A woman named Sue Talitai pointed to a cluster of palm trees half submerged in mud. "Those are ghost trees," she said. "They mark the old village boundary. When the tide comes in, I can almost see the bamboo fences we used to keep the fish ponds separate." In Solomon Islands, in a mangrove swamp near Honiara, I met a youth leader called Jarrow. He showed me Google Earth images of his home island, Choiseul, where half the shoreline had eroded since his grandmother's time. "High seas come in faster now," he said, voice steady despite the anxiety. "Every cyclone we lose more trees, more land. Families move inland. We build stilt houses in places where we used to fish. It's not the flood of legend, it's the flood of reality." I, Kumari Kandam, memory in the monsoons. My journey began in Tamil Nadu, where monsoon rains turned dry gullies into charging torrents. In Kanyakumari's last coastal hamlet, I lodged in a thatched guest house perched on eroding sand dunes. Each evening, I walked to the shoreline to meet Cannon, the village elder. He was a stocky man in his 70s, weathered skin like old parchment, eyes bright in the lamplight. "I remember stories from my father," Cannon said one night. He heard from his father stories of cities with 5-story granaries, of temples inlaid with gold, of scholars who taught sages in Sri Lanka. Then the sea rose. It began with higher tides during cyclones, then land cracked and water poured in. Ships dashed against walls that were once streets. I probed gently. "Do you know when this happened?" He shook his head. "Not precisely. They say several thousand years ago, before the Tamil script. But I know my grandfather spoke of saltwater flooding paddy fields his father planted. Marine geologists I later spoke with told me that the continental shelf off southern India and Sri Lanka emerged during the last glacial maximum, when global sea level was as much as 120 meters lower than drowned during the Holocene, transgression around 8,0 BCE. Sandbanks now lie miles from the shore. Sonar surveys reveal submerged river valleys and limestone platforms that once stood above water. Cannon took me to a freshwater spring hidden in the dunes. Its clear water formed a small pool before seeping through sand into the sea. He tossed his sandal aside and stood knee-deep, gazing westward. "They say the water here still tastes of Kumari Kandam," he said. "It is the last trace of the land." 2. Lyonesse, Arthurian echoes and Cornish currents. In Cornwall, the rhythm of tides seemed inseparable from myth. I travelled to the village of Marazion, where St. Michael's Mount rose like a half-drowned castle in Mounts Bay. A local historian, Eileen Pentreath, guided me along the promontory's causeway, which is walkable at low tide. "They call this Moor Camp, the Dead Land," Eileen explained. "It is said that when Lyonesse sank, Mounts Bay claimed Cornish villages. Fishermen told of seeing parishes disappearing beneath the tide and hearing church bells toll from the deep. Eileen led me to a section of sandy beach marked by a circle of standing stones. "They say this circle was once in a field," she said. "Now it stands in the surf at high tide, like a ring of drowned druids." Archaeological studies indicate that sea level rise in the Atlantic, coupled with storm surges and coastal erosion, inundated low-lying lands in that region during the late Holocenerally between 2,0 BCE and 500 CE. Sediment cores from tidal flats reveal buried peat layers overlain by marine silts, signaling a transition from freshwater bogs to brackish marsh to open sea. Eileen narrated the revival of local interest in Leoniseth, way that medieval chronicles mention a kingdom that vanished in a single night of misfortune, how fishermen still drag up dressed stone blocks in their nets, and how modern divers locate rectangular foundations off small islands in the bay. "Myths may be embellished," she said, "but the land did exist." 3. Atlantis, Plato's warning, modern search. No story captures the imagination quite like Atlantis. In my university office, I pulled Plato's Timaeus and Critias from the shelf. Descriptions of an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. A utopia destroyed by cataclysm. For 2 millennia, scholars debated whether Atlantis was allegory or lost geography. During a conference in Athens, I debated with classicist Dr. Helena Papanikolaou. She argued that Plato's tale was a moral parable about hubris. I countered that seismic subsidence and tsunamis have swallowed ancient sites Mili in Greece's western coast. Pavlopetri off Peloponneso, perhaps Atlantis was founded on real flood memories. Stanford geologist Dr. Michael Kaplan introduced me to sonar maps of the Strait of Gibraltar, showing circular, submerged structures, Ring of Atlantis, asked headlines. Yet proof remained elusive. Still, the Atlantic margin has sunken landscapes, Doggerland beneath the North Sea, flooded coastlines in the Gulf of Mexico, drowned river valleys off the Iberian shellfall carved by post-glacial sea level rise. Atlantis, if it existed, may lie beyond our sonar's range or under thick sediment. IV. Pacific Islanders. Living traditions, rising tides. The most poignant tales came from the Pacific. In Kiribati's Tarawa Atoll, I met a school principal, Mariana Arif, who recounted her grandmother's stories of walking between islets on exposed reef flats at low tide. "Now those flats are always underwater," she said. "We lost our ancestral paths." In Fiji's Lau Islands, elders told of villages relocating inland after storm surges in the 1950s. In the Marshall Islands, council members described meeting halls rebuilt on newer motus after seaward erosion claimed the old ones. In Papua New Guinea's Tufi region, the Maka people spoke of mangrove forests turning to open water as sea levels climb. At the Pacific Climate Warriors Conference, I joined youth delegates weaving palm leaf protest banners. "We are not drowning, we are fighting," they chanted. They cited island inundations as proof that global emissions must fall. Their ancestors' oral histories passed through song and chant documented shoreline change over generations, binding climate science to cultural memory. V. Common themes, adaptation and loss. Across seas and centuries, legends of drowned lands share recurring motifs: kingdoms punished by gods, cataclysmic floods, survivors fleeing to higher ground. Yet beneath myth lies truth. Coasts are dynamic, responding to ice wave cycles, tectonic shifts, and storm surges. Human societies have migrated, adapted, or vanished as sea levels rose and shorelines retreated. I interviewed communities to learn how they cope. In Tamil Nadu, fishermen built stilt houses on deeper stilts and rotated ponds for saltwater and freshwater shrimp to manage salinity. In Cornwall, towns erected seawalls and installed tide gates, but sometimes at the cost of accelerated erosion downdrift. In Tuvalu, island councils planned shoreline fortifications with geotextile tubes and imported sand, though they worry those gains may erode before their grandkids graduate. In Louisiana's Barataria Bay, communities convert land to marsh by breaching river levees to let sediment flow, trying to rebuild land on sinking grounds. ZIGS. Research and preservation. Archaeologists combine sonar, coring, and deep water ROVs to map submerged ruins. Paleoclimatologists analyze coral microatolls in the Indian Ocean to measure relative sea level change using growth rings. Geomorphologists track beach profiles and map abandoned shoreline markers. Geneticists study coastal tree rings in mangroves to date past storm inundations. Historians hunt chronicles of extraordinary tides and tsunamissage as the 365 CE Crete earthquake or 14th century floodstow contextualize oral traditions. Digital heritage projects create 3D reconstructions of sunken sites, offering virtual dives into drowned settlements. Local museums in Cornwall display amphora shards from Lyonness's submerged harbour, while Tamil Nadu's museums exhibit ancient pottery dredged from the continental shelf. In the Pacific, cultural centres hold recorded chants and legends, ensuring that even if islands vanish, the memory endures. 7. Reflections on impermanence. As I flew home over a map outlined in shimmering lights, I pondered how coastlines are threshold lands between human endeavour and nature's vast forces. Atlantis and Lyonnesse remind us of the fleeting nature of civilization. Kumari Kandam and Pacific Island memories ground us in geologic time. Real drowned villages testify to immediate challenges of sea level rise. We are caretakers of both land and memory. By listening to legends, we uncover echoes of real events. By studying submerged ruins, we validate ancient stories. By preserving oral histories, we honor communities adapting to changing shores. In those tales part myth, part memory, part geology, we find wisdom, that land and water are in constant dialogue, that human societies must move and adapt, that the stories we tell bind us across generations. 8. Conclusion. Living with the waves. I think back to Cannon on the Tamil shore, to Eileen by Land's End, to Grace in Tuvalu teaching children songs of ghosts beneath the waves. They all shared one truth. We live on the edge, and that edge sometimes shifts beneath our feet. Their legends are not mere fairy tales, but lifelines, warnings, and guides for communities facing an uncertain future. As the sea continues its inexorable rise, we must heed those messages, build homes that float, plant trees that protect, create maps that incorporate both memory and data, and preserve stories that anchor us to the past. In that convergence of myth and reality lies our hope, to adapt not with despair but with reverence for the land, the sea, and the stories that bind them. The legends of drowned lands mirror real inundations, bridging the gap between myth and geology. They remind us that, just as Atlantis may lie buried off some distant shore, our own coastal cities Venice, New York, Dhaka stand on borrowed land that may one day slip beneath the waves. By weaving oral histories, archaeological evidence, and scientific research, we can chart a course forward aware that the tides may yet carry away our footprints, but determined that our stories will endure. I first stood on the edge of Battery Park City in the summer of 2019, gazing out across the wide expanse of New York Harbor. The skyline lower Manhattan's towering glass and steel rose like a dream behind me, while in front, ferries and tugboats churned through the water. Here, on land reclaimed from the Hudson, the future of coastal cities was on display. Sleek apartment towers and manicured promenades, built atop landfill and concrete caissons to transform mudflats into million-dollar real estate. Yet, beneath my feet, the bedrock of Manhattan lay 50 feet below, and between me and the Battery's polished lawn lay rising seas and intensifying storms. Battery Park City began in the 1970s as a visionary response to a cramped, aging lower Manhattan. Fresh landfill dredged from the harbor was deposited behind a protective seawall of granite blocks. Streets were laid, parks planted, and soon families moved in, lured by views of Lady Liberty and the promise of a new neighborhood. But even as the community flourished, city planners logged the ever-growing risk. Climate scientists warned that storm surges, amplified by climate change, could inundate the reclaimed land within decades. For a city that survives on imagination and ambition, Battery Park City would become a laboratory for confronting a watery future. By 2012, Superstorm Sandy made those warnings painfully real. A surge of 18 feet roared over the seawall, flooding the streets, disabling power substations, and scouring the parks clean of soil and plants. Emergency crews traced the flood tide's footprint across streets where wheelchairs and trash barrels drifted in ankle-deep water. The The seawall, once thought impregnable, had been overtopped. Infrastructure conceived for tide lines couldn't withstand a storm surge fueled by record sea surface temperatures and astronomical high tides. Battery Park City's roads and pathways were underwater, its buildings on standby generators, and its residents facing evacuation. In the storm's aftermath, official city, state, and federal scrambled to repair damage. At the same time, they launched an ambitious planning effort. Imagine a coastline that flexes and adapts rather than stands rigid. In that spirit, the Big U concept emerged, a protective system of berms, deployable floodwalls, raised park pavilions, and living shorelines encircling Lower Manhattan like a giant horseshoe. Designers spoke of resilience as a verb, the capacity to absorb shock, reconfigure, and continue. Battery Park City, at the southern tip, would benefit from this integrated approach, adding new levees and floodgates while preserving the green spaces that make the district so beloved. Walking the promenade today, you see evidence of these changes. Granite benches sit atop fiberglass flood barriers that, in an emergency, slide into place. Springs of native grasses have been planted at the water's edge to slow waves, and maple trees line raised walkways built to remain dry even in a Category 2 hurricane. Beneath one pavilion, a series of angled wood planks can drop down to form a reinforced seawall. It is both elegant and utilitarian, a testament to New York's capacity to marry form and function under pressure. Yet the models are stark. Under high-wind sea level projections feet of rise by 2050, 3 by 2000, 100 Battery Park City's flood risk remains significant. Simulations show that even with the Big U fully implemented, extreme storm surges could still breach the defenses, dragging saltwater into subway vents and power tunnels. The tables in the city's climate reports flash red. Areas labeled very high risk, where flood depths exceed several feet, rendering ground floors uninhabitable and infrastructure vulnerable. For many residents, resilience means adaptation, and perhaps retreat if adaptation proves too costly or temporary. While Manhattan pursues high-tech defenses at Manhattan speed and scale, another American community has chosen a different path. On the Bayou Lafourche in Louisiana, Ile de Jean-Charles is the tip of Terrebonne Parish, a narrow strip of land once carpeted in cypress swamps and marsh grasses. Its isle was home to Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw families, for generations families who fished, trapped crawfish, and lived in timber houses on pilings above the water. But encroaching saltwater, channel dredging, and subsidence drew the Gulf of Mexico ever closer, eroding the shoreline and turning marsh into open water. By the early 2000s, Ile de Jean-Charles lost over 90% of its landmass. Houses that once sat above marsh now teetered on mudflats at high tide. During hurricanes, storm surges roared in, bypassing levees and flooding homes. Drinking wells turned brackish, septic tanks floated, cemeteries collapsed into water. Residents watched as the horizon expanded inland, swallowing fields and bayous. The land on which their ancestors walked washed away. With nowhere left to retreat, the isle's residents petitioned state and federal authorities for assistance. In a rare move, the Department of Housing and Urban Development awarded them a grant to plan a managed retreat. Over several community meetings, residents debated where to move: up the bayou, inland to higher ground, or west toward New Orleans mounds. They weighed the value of staying near sacred burial grounds against the safety of new houses on solid ground. They chatted in Creole, patois, and English, sharing memories of floods and celebrations, birthing their own vision of relocation that would preserve communal bonds even if the land itself was lost. In 2016, the resettlement plan was announced. Families could move to New Isle, a 515-acre site near Pointe-aux-Chenes, where a new community of 400 homes, schools, and cultural centers would rise. The site, purchased with HUD funds, was on stable land behind a freshwater marsh buffer. The designs featured raised buildings on stilts, streets doubled as evacuation routes, and canals lined with mangroves to filter storm surges. The relocation plan centered on cultural preservation. Residents would maintain sacred sites, hold annual ceremonies, and build a museum showcasing the isle's history and ecology. For many, moving was bittersweet. They had to leave their homes, inheritance land parcels, and community gathering places, Some elder residents worried they wouldn't see the mounds of their ancestors again. Others embraced the move as a lifelinian opportunity to escape chronic flooding and restore children's safety. In focus groups, youth sketched designs for skateboard parks and community kitchens. Elders emphasized the need for a mosque and a stage for traditional dances. The relocation was not only physical but social, reinforcing bonds, sharing stewardship of cultural heritage and adapting to a changing world. Today, some families have moved to New Isle, raising homes on pilings above prairie grasses and bayous. They travel by boat along winding canals in front of their porches. The first school opening featured a ribbon new-cutting ceremony where the oldest resident blessed the building with prayer and honey water. On its walls, murals depict scenes of life on the water, nets cast at dawn, egrets dancing on marsh poles, and children playing on tree stumps. The new community embraces its identity as a climate-resilient town known that honors its past while adapting its future. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, Battery Park City's residents watch the southern horizon for the next hurricane, planning for flood insurance renewals and keeping sandbags at the ready. They rent out apartments on Airbnb for displaced friends during storms, sharing tips for sealing windows with plywood. Community boards hold drills for coastal storm risk management systems and partake in climate resilience committees. They install backup generators identical to the ones their parents bought after Sandy. They debate the merits of floodproofing ground floors versus moving critical infrastructure's hubway ventilation shafts, electrical vault stow higher levels. Supporters of managed retreat point to Isle de Jean Charles as a template, proactive, community-driven relocation that preserves social networks and culture. Skeptics worry about the costs, potential billions to buy out homeowners in Manhattan, far more than a few dozen houses in Louisiana. They ask, can a city as vast and complex as New York truly move parts of itself? What would it cost to elevate entire neighborhoods or relocate vital services? Some propose a hybrid approach. Critical infrastructure moves inland, while waterfront property transforms into new wetlands or public parks designed to absorb storm surges, an urban aquapark that serves as both amenity and buffer. In the United Kingdom's Thames estuary, planners envision Thames Tideway, flood barriers and riverside residential towers with ground floors designed as public promenades and water parks during high tides. In Japan, Tokyo Bay's seawall expansions are coupled with floating neighborhoods on barges tethered to the shore, self-contained districts rising and falling with the tide. In the Netherlands, island communities in the Rhine, Meuse Delta partner with hydrologists to shape controlled flooding zones that reinforce dunes and recharge aquifers. Coastal cities worldwide share a common reckoning. Erosion and inundation are no longer distant threats but present-day realities. Whether by building higher walls, floating homes, adaptive landscapes, or relocating entire towns, communities must decide how to live with water. The lessons of Battery Park City and Isle de Jean Charles show two paths: defend or withdrawn, the necessity of choosing based on local conditions, cultural ties, and economic capacities. In 2025, when a Category 3 hurricane grazed Long Island, Battery Park City's deployable flood barriers snapped into place, and water levels remained below the raised promenades. Residents packed the Boardwalk Cafe afterward, sipping coffee on plastic chairs and murmuring thanks that their neighborhood's design had protected them. Elsewhere in the borough, subway tunnels filled, drivers abandoned cars on submerged avenues, and thousands evacuated. But Battery Park City's experiment in resilience held. On the same day, a tropical storm tipped into the Gulf of Mexico, inundating Ile de Jean Charles's old footprint, where a handful of families stayed behind in hopes of holding fast, only to find their houses underwater on stilts. New Isle's residents watched the radar from dry land, but they could see the water pour through the old banks, reclaiming a fragment of lost terrain. They toasted each other via video call. Here we stand, on higher ground. Back at my desk, I map these two settings, New York's peninsula and coastal Louisiana, a case study in adaptation. They remind me that cities are not immortal, not eternally fixed. They too lie on shores that shift, sands that migrate, soils that sink, and waters that rise. The boundaries between land and sea are as fluid as the decisions human communities make: defend, retreat, or accept a perpetual state of becoming. In the end, we may find that defense and retreat are not mutually exclusive. Coastal corridors may hold some neighborhoods in place while allowing others to transition to new landscapes or even wetlands. Infrastructure may be designed to float or fold away like origami at high tide. Cultural heritage may be enshrined in movable museums and digital archives, preserving memory even as the physical ground shifts beneath our feet. As Battery Park City's flood defenses rise and Isle de Jean Charles's houses perch on new pilings, we learn that living on water's edge demands humility, innovation, and community resolve. The cost of defense or the price of retreat both pale in comparison to the value of lives, traditions, and futures. And in both places, the towering towers of Manhattan and the stilted homes of Louisiana see the same effort, human ingenuity rising to meet the waves, determined neither to drown nor to drift apart, but to stand together on shifting shores. I first felt the power of the sea standing atop the crumbling quay at Seaham in northeast England. Below me, waves pounded a narrow beach strewn with smooth granite cobbles. An aging seawall, its concrete face streaked with rust and algae, ran parallel to the high tide line. Behind it, tidy terraces of Victorian houses perched perilously close to the edge. On that blustery afternoon, spray whipped over the wall, drenching the promenade. I watched as a set of guster-driven swells sluiced over the top, then cascaded down the seaward side in miniature waterfalls. It was a raw reminder: the sea always wins, unless it's shown a better path. Around the world, communities erect seawalls, vertical fortifications of concrete or stone to hold the line against eroding waves. Groins project perpendicularly from the shore, trapping sand moving in the longshore drift. Breakwaters stand offshore, shielding harbours and beaches from the open ocean's onslaught. Each structure embodies humanity's impulse to assert dominion over the sea's relentless shifts. Yet each also unwittingly reshapes the coast. When placed without regard to natural sediment flows, they can shrink downdrift beaches, starve dunes of sand, and create new hotspots of erosion. I first encountered this paradox in Cornwall, where a short groin built to protect Perranporth's popular beach had, within a decade, left the neighbouring cove of Godrevy bereft of sand. Holidaymakers in Godrevy found themselves wading across pebbles at low tide, while more than a kilometre north, Perranporth's beach fattened noticeably. Locals joked that a decade's worth of Cornwall's sand had migrated northward, leaving Godrevy's dunes starved and steep. Conversations with coastal engineers revealed the groin's effect. It trapped sand moving south to north, building one beach while starving its neighbour. Further south, at Dawlish, a Victorian seawall built to protect the railway line hugged the cliffs like a ribbon of armour. For over a century, trains thundered along the sea's edge, perched safely above the waves. But in 2014, storm surges banged the wall like a battering ram. A 1-in-100-year storm nearly toppled the tracks. Engineers patched fissures with steel armour plates, yet each repair seemed temporary. Discussions with Network Rail officials unveiled a sobering truth. The seawall deflected the energy of each wave, sometimes amplifying scour at its base and sending turbulence around its ends. The wall worked, until it didn't. Contrast these scrappy defences with the monumental Delta Works in the Netherlands. In 1953, the North Sea flood breached dikes across Zeeland, inundating islands and killing over 1,800 people. In the aftermath, the Dutch launched the Delta Works, an integrated system of 13 storm surge barriers, sluices, locks, dikes, and dams designed to shorten the Dutch coastline and protect 2.8 million hectares of land. The Oosterscheldekering, the largest storm surge barrier in Europe, features towering steel gates that close only when needed, chiseling an elegant compromise between safety and the estuary's tidal nature. I flew over Zeeland one crisp autumn morning, watching Delta Works infrastructure glint in the morning sun. The storm surge barriers lay as faint scars where freshwater rivers met the salt sea. The floodgates of the Maaslandkering hovered like two great arms at the Rotterdam waterway's mouth, ready to swing shut if a storm surge threatens. From above, I sensed the immense investment, economic and cultural, placed into holding back the sea. Yet the Dutch also know their measures are not permanent. They have begun shifting to building with nature and room for the river, strategies, adaptive, dynamic approaches that work with natural processes rather than against them. In the Rhine-Meuse Delta, levees are set back, allowing floodplains to absorb high flows. Old polders are deliberately flooded in controlled ways to ease river peaks. Mud islands are created in the eastern Scheldt to trap sediment and nourish wetlands. Sand nourishment's periodic injections of sand into beaches mimic natural sediment delivery, countering erosion without rigid structures. I visited one such project at Ter Heide on the South Holland coast, where sand was pumped offshore, then guided by coastal currents to dissipate wave energy before it reached the shore. Walk along that beach and you see no groins, no walls, just gently sloping sands that ebb and flow, constantly renewed. Families gather by beach huts set back from the dunes, children play in shallow lagoons, and lifeguards patrol a shore resilient enough to endure winter storms. The Dutch call it Zandmotor, the sand engineer, and it represents a shift from hard engineering to soft adaptation. In Bangladesh, one of the world's most vulnerable deltas, engineers and communities have also begun embracing nature-based solutions. Mangrove belts are replanted to buffer cyclones. Tidal river management reopens silted waterways to rejuvenate deltaic plains. Raised villages' chalets on stilts give villagers elevated platforms safe from floods while waters recede. These measures recognize that rigid defenses cannot endure indefinitely in a delta sinking under the weight of sediment compaction and rising seas. Yet not every community can afford the Dutch model. In the Caribbean, small island nations build concrete seawalls around capital cities, only to see seawalls reflect wave energy into adjacent, unprotected neighborhoods, accelerating erosion there. On islands like Barbados and Antigua, groins built to protect beachfront hotels have left fishermen scrambling over rocks where sand once lay. The fragility of low-lying coastal economies is laid bare by such mismatches of engineering and ecology. In California, coastal retreat has also gained traction as an alternative to endless seawall repair. In Encinitas and Malibu, sections of eroding cliffs are being voluntarily set back homes, relocated inland, roads realigned, dunes restored with native vegetation. The sea claims lands on a geological timescale. Retreat recognizes this rule rather than fight it. Yet retreat is costly, confronts property rights head-on, and demands political will. Few places embrace it wholeheartedly. Back in New York, Battery Park City's managers convened a summit in 2018 to discuss managed retreat alongside flood defenses. Panels asked, could we elevate streets rather than walls, or build floating parks that rise with tides? Or would some waterfront parcels be resin-gentle buyouts offered to willing homeowners creating wetlands that absorb storm energy? The conversations reflected a growing awareness. Hard structures can only do so much. Without breathing space for water, the next storm will overtop defenses once again. A few blocks north, in the Lower East Side, artist activists installed chalk tide lines on storefront windows after each major storm, visual reminders of water heights in 2012, 2017, 2021. They organized storm chowder events, inviting neighbors to share seafood recipes that celebrate both the sea's bounty and its looming threats. Community gardens began planting salty-tolerant greenery on raised beds. All of it pointed to adaptation at the grassroots small scale, community-driven efforts complementing macro-scale engineering. I spoke with a gardener named Marisol Reyes, who leads a pilot living seawall project on Governor's Island. There, granite blocks from old piers are interspersed with concrete planters hosting oysters, mussels, and native marsh grasses. Wave action reveals these oysters clinging to pockmarked surfaces, filtering water and gluing sediment to their shells. Marisol hopes that over time, the living seawall will accrete mud and dampen wave force, turning an inert barrier into a dynamic reef ecosystem. Meanwhile, on the shores of Lake Superior in Duluth, Minnesota, engineers have used submerged breakwaters made of limestone boulders to protect shoreline parks from storm waves. The breakwaters create calm lagoons where fish spawn and kayakers paddle, while sediment settles behind the structures to nourish beaches. Local environmental groups monitor the buildup of sand and vegetation, noting how nature reclaims and stabilizes the structures. It is another example of working with the waves rather than resisting them bluntly. In Australia's Gold Coast, a mishmash of seawalls, groins, and beach nourishment projects. Collectively, one of the largest coastal engineering endeavours on the planet has provided mixed results. Some beaches have remained wide and sandy. Others have shrunk dramatically, especially at groin-starved intervals. Local councils spend millions each year pumping sand from offshore shoals, only to see it wash away within seasons. A new report recommended more soft approaches, restoring dunes with native spinifex grasses, setting back development zones, and making room for nature to build its own defenses. In my home city of Boston, I watched the Rose Kennedy Greenway extension and seawall improvements slowly take shape along Fort Point Channel. The project included floodgates and hinged flood panels integrated into Plaza Sleek, hidden until needed. Planners proposed go-with-the-flow measures, public squares designed to flood during extreme events, amphitheaters that double as flood basins, and pavilions raised on columns to let water pass beneath. It was a local iteration of the lessons forged in the Netherlands, adapted to Boston's granite geology and colonial architecture. As I mapped these stories, the groin-built rise of Perranporth's beach, Battery Park City's flood barriers, Isle de Jean Charles's relocation, the Netherlands' Delta Works and Zanmotor, Bangladesh's mangrove belts, California's retreats, Governor's Island's living seawall, see a tapestry of human responses to coasts in flux. No single approach suffices. Hard structures may be necessary for critical infrastructure. Soft, nature-based solutions can extend the life of beaches. Retreat remains the ultimate concession where all else fails. Perhaps most crucial is the willingness to learn from each approach's successes and failures. A groin may solve erosion in one pocket but starve its neighbor unless paired with periodic sand bypassing. A seawall may save a rail line but amplify scour unless designed with stepped revetments and beach nourishment behind it. A storm surge barrier can protect a harbor but corral stormwater into adjacent lowland sunless combined with floodable green spaces inland. In Zealand, I walked along a newly realigned river channel where the Delta Works had given way to a Room for the River project. Levees set back to widen the floodplain, side channels carved to relieve peak flows, and land purposely flooded under controlled conditions. Farmers with shifting fields adapted to hosting rice paddies or fish farms in winter floods, while communities built homes on mound historic turp safe from spring inundations. It was a holistic dance of water and land, culture and nature finding balance. Back at Seaham, I climbed down from the battered seawall to walk along the shingle beach. The tide was high, pushing pebbles up around my ankles. Beyond lay the open Atlantic, impossible to fence out. But behind me, dunes stabilized by marram grass invited a morning walk, and a recently installed artificial reef submerged offshore breakwaters of Limestone had begun accreting fish and acting as a wave buffer. A small information kiosk explained the combined strategy. A seawall here, a living dune there, an artificial reef beyond a dialogue between steel, sand, and shell. Coastal dynamics demand respect more than domination. The Netherlands' Delta Works stand as a marvel of engineering and as a testament to the limits of rigidity in a shifting world. Adaptive strategies, those that work with currents and waves, offer longer-term resilience. Nature nourishments, managed retreat, and living shorelines embrace the inevitability of change. As seas continue to rise and storms intensify, the lesson rings clear: build with the tide, not against it. Only then will our cities and coastlines endure the ever-turning wheel of land and sea. I first heard the thundering roar of breakers not on my local beach, but through the crackling speakers of a coastal monitoring station in Virginia Beach. It was late summer 2018, and meteorologists predicted another powerful nor'easter, the fourth, in as many months would whip waves onto the shore at heights unseen in decades. I stood beside Dr. Amelia Clark, a coastal engineer with the city's Department of Public Works, as she reviewed wave height forecasts and shoreline change maps on her laptop. "Look here," she said, pointing to a color-coded map. "This red zone marks 2 years of chronic erosion. We've lost nearly 20 meters of beach since 2015 in this stretch." The map showed a series of gently curving spits just north of the Chesapeake Bay Inlet, once a wide, golden arc of sand but now scoured to narrow banks of pebbles and trash. Behind the beach lay a row of aging groins and a seawall built in the 1,960-shard structures that, over time, starved downdrift beaches of sand and reflected wave energy back onto the sand, accelerating erosion. I braced myself against a sudden gust of wind carrying brine and spray, imagining the waves battering that seawall that very night. Dr. Clark shook her head. Seawalls buy time, but they don't restore beaches. We need sand. Nature moves sand along shore constantly. We need to replicate that. She closed her laptop and turned to me. Come see the nursery. 2 days later, I followed her onto an old, oystery-topped barge anchored offshore. A fleet of dredges, gunmetal hulls painted orange and white, churned through the shallow continental shelf, inhaling sand, silt, and seashell fragments through giant pipes. The machinery throbbed like a heart, and long hoses arched from the dredge to the beach, vomiting pale slurry onto the shore. Waves picked up the finer grains and carried them laterally, smearing the new sand east and west in thin ribbons. Crews with surveying instruments paced the wet sand to ensure the correct contour and elevation, like sculptors shaping the coastline. You see how the new sand fills the troughs between the groins? Dr. Clark asked, as we stood on the freshly nourished beach. We gamely tried groins decades ago, but without nourishment, the sand vanishes. Now we're injecting sediment just where nature wants it, then letting the longshore currents work their magic. While the dredges worked, biologist Carlos Mendoza surveyed the reformed dunes with a handheld GPS. He was looking for the first signs of shorebird nesting plovers and terns that rely on wide open beaches to lay their eggs on bare sand above the high Otiu tide line. Before nourishment, he'd found only a handful of plover nests in that zone. The narrow beaches offered little refuge from waves and predators. Now, he counted over 60 nests in the first month after nourishment, neatly spaced along the newly formed upper beach. These birds literally depend on our project, he said, crouching to snap a photo of a piping plover's sandy-colored egg. When they return each spring, adults look for open expanses of sand. If they don't find any, they go elsewhere or abandon nesting altogether. With nourished beaches, we've restored habitat they thought lost. Over the following months, I accompanied Carlos on low tide surveys, watching him approach nests with reverent caution, while his team leashed off sections of beach to keep recreational traffic at bay. Volunteers posted signs reading, "Protected shorebird habitat, please stay behind this line." Surfers and sunbathers diverted inland, trading panoramic ocean views for cooler boardwalk shadows. Beachgoers grumbled at first, but Carlos's gentle educational outreach beach walks where children learned how plover chicks peeped for their parents won hearts and minds. By the end of the first year, the shoreline had stabilized. Annual surveys measured net volumetric gains of 15,000 cubic meters of sand, enough to offset typical winter storm losses for at least 3 years. The nourished zone's profile, a gentle slope rising from 0 to 3 meters above mean sea level, remained remarkably intact. In sunnier months, people picnicked above the dunes, squirrels darted along the grass line, and shorebirds chirped their territorial calls from shallow depressions they had scraped in the sand, temporary nests nearly invisible until you stepped too close. News of the project spread up and down the coast. Neighboring counties, facing similar erosion, sent delegations to observe the dredge operations and talk with Dr. Clark's team. They saw how sand nourishment could be calibrated, more sediment-added frontal-loading areas most prone to erosion, using cone-shaped diverter berms to channel sediment where longshore drift was strongest. They saw how nourished beaches could support not only beachgoers but vital nesting wildlife, and how the process could be repeated in multi-year cycles rather than expensive one-off interventions. To understand the science behind these successes, I sat in on a university seminar at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Professor Linda Wu, a geomorphologist, explained the concept of dynamic equilibrium, the idea that coastlines naturally balance sediment inputs and outputs over decades. "We're not trying to hold the line forever," she said. "We're merely helping the beach stay near its historical position. If sea level rises, we'll need to add more sand, but that's cheaper and more ecologically friendly than building taller walls." She overlaid satellite imagery of the Virginia coast from 1980 to 2020. The lines traced shifting beach positions. Some areas advanced landward during periods of high sediment supply from nearby inlets, then retreated during storm cycles. Nourishment, she argued, could flatten the amplitude of these swings, smoothing out extreme erosion events and reducing the frequency of emergency responses. Yet nourishment was not a cure-all. Environmental groups warned of turbidity plumes from dredging, disturbing benthic habitats and fish spawning grounds. To mitigate impacts, the project timed dredging for months when sensitive species horseshoe crab larvae, oyster spat were not settling. Monitors measured water clarity, and divers rescued trapped juvenile fish from dredge intake screens. Consultations with the Navy and Coast Guard ensured that dredge operations did not interfere with navigation channels or submarine routes. As the second spring approached, I returned to the beach with Dr. Clark and Carlos, cameras and notebooks in hand. We watched as plover chicks hatched, their downy bodies scuttling across the sand in bursts of energy. Volunteers counted fledglings, reporting a fledging success rate 3 times higher than pre-nourishment years. Carlos beamed as he radioed data to the Environmental Protection Office in Richmond. "They're thriving," he said. "We're not just keeping sand in place, we're rebuilding an ecosystem." Meanwhile, I spoke with local business owners who depended on tourism. The owner of a beachfront cafe told me that patrons had returned not only for the coffee and donuts but for the expansive beach views. Surf lessons continued uninterrupted as the new sand smoothed previously rocky bottoms. Kayak tour operators, previously cautious about narrows and shoals, found beaches that had been trucked back onto the shore, creating new access points for launches. "It's good for business," she said, wiping down tables as customers arrived. "We get the ocean without the obstructions." One afternoon, as I walked the dunes behind the beach, I encountered a small group of sand fence enthusiasts, volunteers who erected short cedar slats in zigzag patterns to trap windblown sand and build dunes naturally. They met once a month, educating walkers to plant dune grass and respect roped-off areas. I paused to talk to Anna, a retired teacher whose grandchildren considered the beach their second home. "We nourish the beach," she said, planting a fistful of grass plugs, "and we also teach the community to protect these dunes. Together, engineering and ecology can keep our coast vital. Long-term monitoring remains critical. Every year, hydrographic surveys chart the underwater bar and nearshore profiles. Shoreline mapping with drones tracks the landward edge of the beach and the condition of the dunes. Ecologists continue to count plover pairs, roseate tern nests, and oyster spat settlement rates on submerged reef structures placed offshore. City budgeters review the cost-benefit analysis. Millions spent on nourishment versus tens of millions in damage avoided from erosion and storm surges. Early results show that a well-planned nourishment cycle costs a fraction of seawall repairs or flood insurance payouts. Even so, the project faces challenges. Supply risks arise if the offshore borrow areas, the sand sources, become depleted, or if environmental regulations restrict dredging. Sea level rise projections indicate that by mid-century, beaches will need more frequent renourishment, perhaps every 2 years rather than every 5. Storm intensification under climate change may mobilize sand faster than anticipated, demanding flexible funding and adaptive management. To ensure sustainability, Dr. Clark's team is integrating sand nourishment with broader sediment management. They advocate for sediment budgets at regional scales, coordinating nourishment projects with inlet maintenance dredging, inland sediment retention strategies in rivers, and even land management upstream to deliver more sand to the coast. They host annual workshops with Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Geological Survey, and state agencies to harmonize efforts. The goal? Treat sand as a resource to be managed holistically, rather than pumped on a project-by-project basis. One evening, I joined a community forum in a packed elementary school gym. Over 90 residents, from surfers and ecologists to hoteliers and retirees, crowded the rows, eager for updates. Dr. Clark displayed before and after aerial photos showing a once-eroded beach regained through nourishment. Carlos unveiled data on shorebird recovery. Local council members announced funding for the next nourishment cycle. A hush fell as they projected a model showing the beach's potential shape in 2050 under various nourishment and sea level rise scenarios. The audience nodded, some whispering, "That's hopeful," others murmuring, "We must stay vigilant." As I stepped outside, the Atlantic breeze carried the scent of ozone and kelp. Across the street, neon signs flickered over fresh-pressed ice cream counters. Families wandered home along lit boulevards, literal laughter blending with the sea's distant roar. Behind me, the beach lay broad and firm, dunes crowned with grass that swayed like green flames. The Nourishment Project had done its work, sand restored, habitat renewed, community rallied. But more cycles awaited, surveys, funds, dredges, and beach plantings. It was a never-ending story, one that mirrored natural processes of erosion and accretion, seasons of growth and retreat. I thought back to the first nor'easter forecast in 2018, the battered seawall at Seaham, the submerged oyster reefs of Governor's Island, the setback levees of New Orleans, and the room for the river in the Netherlands. Everywhere, communities learned to work with nature's rhythms, sometimes resisting, sometimes retreating, sometimes restoring. In Virginia Beach, sand nourishment became a lesson in humility. Dunes are islands of refuge in a sea of change, and sand is life's currency on the shore. When I left the city, I took one last walk on the nourished beach at sunrise. A lone jogger's footprints traced a line between water and dune. A clustered chorus of piping plovers chirped in the hollows. The sun-striped waves spread a quilt of foam across resurgent sand. And somewhere in that meeting of land and sea, I saw the promise of sustainable action, understanding nature's processes not to conquer them, but to collaborate with them, ensuring that beaches endure for beachgoers, shorebirds, and dreamers yet to come. The late afternoon sun slanted across the Mirror Flat estuary as Dr. Priya Natarajan and I watched the latest Landsat imagery unfurl on her laptop. We sat in a room packed with engineers, ecologists, and urban planners, the Coastal Resilience Task Force for the Bay of Stockton. On screen, the long ribbon of shoreline curved between salt marsh and suburban development. Next to it, colour-coded swaths glowed, blues and greens where land was safe, yellows and oranges where moderate erosion and inundation were projected, and deep reds where the models forecast near certain loss by mid-century. Priya tapped a yellow patch at the estuary's mouth. This zone is likely to lose 5 to 10 metres of shoreline by 2050 under RCP 8.5, she said. High-end warming, accelerated sea level rise, and increased storminess converge here. The room fell silent. On that strip of land stood a neighbourhood of tract homes, a boat ramp, and a city park, beloved by weekend anglers and kite surfers. "Do we pull back development?" asked Commissioner Martinez, leaning forward. "Or do we defend its seawalls, breakwaters? What's our strategy?" Priya, whose PhD was in numerical modelling of coastal dynamics, smiled wryly. "Both options carry trade-offs. Defending that spit with a vertical seawall could protect 50 homes, but risk starving downdrift beaches of sand, threatening wetlands that buffer storm surge. A managed retreat rezoning that area as open space would be more sustainable, but politically fraught." She clicked to overlay a digital elevation model, showing the neighbourhood perched on the highest ground within the red zone. Elevation here is just 2 metres above present sea level. The task force began to debate, guided by Integrated Coastal Zone Management (ICZM) principles. Manage the coast as a system. Plan for long-term resilience, balance environmental, social, and economic goals. They had spent the last year compiling remote sensing data, satellite radar, LiDAR, UAV photogrammetry, and running those datasets through processor-based models that simulate tides, waves, sediment transport, and shoreline change. They now had decade projections, down to precise grid cells along the bay's 150-kilometre perimeter. Over the next 2 hours, the group drilled into the data, which zones were prone to chronic erosion, which to episodic storm damage, and which marshes stood to drown under rapid sea level rise. They mapped critical infrastructure, water treatment plants, electrical substations, roads against the hazard layers. They weighed public versus private lands, noting where vulnerable neighbourhoods might warrant buyout programs. They identified candidate sites for living shorelines, nature-based buffers of marsh plantings and oyster reefs, and corridors for managed retreat, where parks and wetlands could migrate inland as waters climbed. By late evening, they had produced a draft coastal resilience plan, a layered strategy combining hard defences at key choke points, natura-based features along softer stretches, and policy tools, zoning revisions, rolling easements, and voluntary relocation incentives in high-risk areas. They set priorities for investment, with an initial focus on the red hotspots, retreat in some, defend in others, and enhance natural buffers everywhere. The plan called for annual updates as new data emerged, embracing the ICZM ethos of adaptive management. In the months that followed, remote sensing teams refined their forecasts. SAR, synthetic aperture radar. Satellites monitored shoreline retreat in near real time, detecting centimeter-scale land loss after winter storms. UAV flights captured high-resolution topography of dunes and marsh platforms, while tide gauges and GNSS stations tracked land subsidence and sea level trends. Process models coupled riverway discharge scenarios with sediment budgets, predicting where deltas would build or erode. Each data stream fed into a coastal digital tweener virtual simulation that stakeholders could spin forward under various climate scenarios. Local developers learned to consult the coastal twin before proposing new subdivisions. If a parcel lay within the orange zone, moderate-risk projects required elevated foundations and dune-friendly designs. No new construction was permitted in red zone lands, now designated as climate parks. Homeowners in yellow areas were offered property buyouts at pre-flood values, funded through a state resilience bond. Federal grants supported the construction of marsh sills and living breakwaters in blue-green zones, where nature-based defenses could flourish. School curricula introduced students to ICZM, teaching them how to read hazard maps and design virtual defenses in the coastal twin. Community workshops trained citizen scientists to monitor shoreline change with GPS-enabled smartphones. Traditional knowledge holders, tribal elders who had lived by the bay for generations, collaborated with scientists, sharing observations of shifting channels and declining shellfish beds, adding cultural dimensions to the data. 5 years into the plan, change was visible on the ground. In one red zone neighborhood, Sunset Heights, houses that once bordered tidal flats now sat behind a newly planted marsh, the streets converted into raised boardwalks. The boardwalk doubled as a flood barrier during storms, and benches overlooked the wetland expanse where herons nested among Spartina blades. Electricity lines and sewage lines, once buried, had been elevated on pylons. Sunset Heights became a resilience demonstration district, attracting tourists curious about coastal adaptation. At the bay's mouth, engineers completed a living shoreline pilot, a series of breakwater reefs constructed from oyster-laden concrete modules, spaced offshore to break waves and encourage sediment deposition. Behind the reefs, marsh grasses took root in the calmer water. After 2 winters, the pilot site showed a net gain of nearly a meter of shoreline, transforming eroded mudflats into a new, self-maintaining wetland. Visitors from other coastal communities toured the site, taking notes to replicate the approach at home. The integrated plan remained dynamic. Each winter, after major storms, coastal teams conducted post-event mapping using UAVs and RTK GPS. Models were recalibrated, shifting hazard zones where necessary. Public dashboards displayed near-acre time shoreline positions, tide gauge readings, and subsidence trends. Alert systems warned residents when high tides and storm surges align. When a nor'easter in 2023 threatened to overtop historic seawalls, authorities activated deployable flood barriers and issued beach closures, relying on forecasts from the coastal twin to time interventions. The project drew national attention. Conferences showcased the Bay of Stockton's data-driven, integrated approach as a model for other U.S. coastal regions from the Gulf of Maine to San Francisco Bay. Funding flowed in from FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, EPA's Climate Ready Estuaries Initiative, and private foundations. PhD students flocked to study under Priya Natarajan, eager to wield remote sensing and numerical modeling for societal benefit. Yet challenges persisted. Sediment supply from the river delta fluctuated with upstream dam operations, reducing nourishment potential. Extreme precipitation events delivered pulses of fresh water that drowned salt marsh vegetation. Political cycles sometimes strained long-term commitments. And as sea level projections climbed under high emissions pathways, the plan's red zone footprints expanded, prompting renewed debates about retreat versus defend. But the ICZM framework held firm, recognizing no coast can be frozen in place, accepting change as inevitable, and guiding human development to coexist with dynamic shorelines. By integrating remote sensing, modeling, community engagement, and policy tools, the Bay of Stockton charted a path toward resilience, one that could evolve with new data and new challenges. On a clear spring morning in 2030, I returned to that stretch of shoreline where once a yellowy flag zone threatened dissolution. Now, it lay behind a broad salt marsh garden, its channels pointing inland like fingers. Families walked the boardwalks, fishermen launched kayaks from restored beaches, and a kiosk displayed a real-time map of rising tides. In the distance, city planners joined a tribal elder to bless the Marsha ritual, acknowledging the land's perpetual flux and humanity's shared responsibility to steward the edge between land and sea. And so, on that living coast, the story continued. Dynamic, data-driven, and deeply human, an integrated vision of communities adapting to change, guided by foresight and respect for nature's rhythms. The future of coastal cities, it seemed, depended not on resisting the tides, but on learning to read and ride their currents together. Admiral Lucia Santos studied the holographic map hovering above the conference table, its pale blue arcs tracing the shifting lines of her nation's maritime boundaries. As the tides rose along the low coral atolls of Namulaito, the blue of the ocean encroached inch by inch upon the land. Tiny red dots marked weather stations, submerged watchtowers, and the skeletal remains of mangrove forests drowned by salt water. The map's outer archonts, 10 kilometers from shore now, lay only 6 kilometers out, the exclusive economic zone, EEZ, shrinking in real time. Madagascar just proposed a new EEZ border 20 nautical miles from their high tide line, said Captain Eamon Griswold, the naval attaché. But our original treaty fixed the boundary to the baseline that included our low islands. If those islands vanish, so does our baseline and thus our zone. He tapped at a translator module, bringing up the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS text. The baseline for measuring the breadth of the territorial sea is the low water line along the coast as marked on large-scale charts officially recognized by the coastal state. Admiral Santos closed her eyes. The law was clear. If land disappears, so might the maritime entitlements built upon that land. For Namulaito, a nation of 150, 0 people sprawled across dozens of ring-shaped atolls barely a meter above sea level. This was existential. The EEZ provided fishing rights, mineral prospecting rights, and sovereign revenues that paid for healthcare and schools. Without territorial sea and EEZ, the nation could lose billions in tuna licenses and seabed mining royalties. Mobilize the diplomatic corps, Santos said softly. We'll convene the Pacific Island Coalition tomorrow. We cannot stand alone. Baltazar. That evening on the coral beach known as the President's Walk, President Aroha Tain met with community elders beneath swaying coconut palms. Lanterns flickered in the breeze. Children paddled canoes along the lagoon's edge, harvesting sea cucumbers for tonight's feast. Aroha had sailed these waters since childhood. She knew each channel by heart. Yet now, invisible hands were erasing her maps. "Our reefs built this land," said Chief Tupu Moana, voice catching. "My father said a man could stand on this very sand only half a century ago and watch the waves break beyond those now submerged rocks." He pointed past the coconut trees to where water lapped at a battered seawall. "Now seawalls only slow the tide. We lose ground each year." Aroha nodded. "We must formalize our stories into legal evidence. We'll partner with marine scientists to map our historical baselines, to show the world what we have lost and what that loss means for our rights under UNCLOS." She turned to the assembly. "We must petition the International Seabed Authority to consider our circumstances. Landlocking by the sea should not automatically extinguish our jurisdictions." Applause rippled through the elders. Their language held words for every channel and reef-living memory of landforms no longer visible. They vowed to share their oral histories as evidence in the coming negotiations. Baltazar. Meanwhile, in the workshop-lined streets of Noumea, French policymakers grappled with a separate dilemma. New Caledonia, a French collectivity, spanned a vast lagoon ringed by a UNESCO World Heritage Barrier Reef. As sea levels rose, some uninhabited islets within the reef drowned, their coconut groves and bird nesting grounds claimed by the waves. France, as the sovereign authority, faced a choice: redraw the territorial and EEZ lines inward, or argue for a fixed baseline protected by the reef itself. In a conference room overlooking the Pacific, Secretary of Overseas France Dominique Laurent presented to her superiors, UNCLOS allows for straight baselines where the coastline is deeply indented or fringed by islands. We can argue that the fringing reef constitutes part of the coastline, preserving a baseline even if the islets disappear. It's an established practice in other archipelagic states. She pointed to examples, parts of Indonesia and the Philippines that enclose waters within archipelagic baselines. Her colleagues nodded. Yet we must prepare for challenges. Neighbouring countries might dispute our claims, citing continental shelves or median lines in the Coral Sea. Another official warned, Australia's fishing fleet eyeing those waters could lobby against our archipelagic argument, pushing for median lines instead. The decision was made. Submit a revised baseline claim based on the outer reef crest, buttressed by geophysical charts and satellite imagery. France's lawyers drafted a dossier for the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, citing the reef's permanence and ecological importance. Balton. On the other side of the Pacific, in Suva, Fiji's negotiators prepared for the annual Pacific Islands Forum. They brought with them a new data package, high-resolution bathymetric maps of submerged former islands, digital records of colonial surveys showing now-lost reefs, and climate-induced acceleration models projecting another half-meter of sea level rise by 2050. Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands share a common plight, said Fijian Foreign Minister Nalini Prasad at the plenary. We are small islands whose very existence is threatened. We demand that the international community adopt a new convention, that traditional baselines rooted in historical and oral evidence remain valid irrespective of temporary submergence due to climate change. She distributed copies of the Coalition of Atoll Nations Declaration on Maritime Continuity. Kiribati's ambassador Tibano Manea took the floor. In 1995, our land was measured to establish our territorial sea. We cannot now be forced to forfeit those rights because the sea intrudes. Our people remain who we have always been. Our boundaries should remain too. Tuvalu's delegate added, we seek recognition of climate refugee equity, that loss of land by rising seas does not extinguish our maritime entitlements. Our coral atolls may vanish, but our nation, our flag, our people remain. Applause filled the hall as dozens of island representatives rose in solidarity. Baltazar's. Yet not every state shared their urgency. In Manila, some voices counseled caution. The Philippines, an archipelagic state with a vast EEZ, worried about setting precedents that could be invoked by others, especially nations less friendly to Manila's own territorial claims. A senior diplomat, Ambassador Ricardo Ling, told me privately, we sympathize, but broadening baseline rules may challenge our own continental shelf claims against China's position in the South China Sea. We must safeguard our interests. China, for its part, monitored the debates. Chinese scholars published op-eds cautioning about slippery slopes. Once baselines decouple from actual coastlines, arbitrary lines might supersede physical geography. They argued that transitory waters areas regularly submerged cannot constitute permanent baselines. Beijing's diplomats prepared counter papers, advocating for strict adherence to the textual baseline definition in UNCLOS. Baltazar. While diplomatic battles raged in conference rooms, islanders on the atolls faced immediate concerns. In Funafuti Atoll, Tuvalu, I stayed in a guest house perched on a narrow spit of sand, its posts sinking into the aquifer-cut coral. At high tide, salt water sloshed beneath the floorboards. In the morning, I joined Tuvalu's Maritime and Ports Authority on a small boat. We passed the old shoreline markers painted poles from the 1970s now lying submerged a meter below the lagoon's surface. The authority's hydrographers surveyed new depths, revising nautical charts weekly. Each chart fed into Fiji's and Kiribati's submissions to the United Nations, showing evidence that the land, and thus the base for maritime claims, had changed irreversibly due to factors beyond local control. Local fishers, whose livelihoods depended on their EEZ fishing rights, voiced fears. If the EEZ shrank, foreign vessels might encroach, outcompeting household boats for tuna and marlin. One fisherman, Api Tafuna, braved boat exhaust and the heat to tell me, our nets have always cast wide under our flag. If those nets must shrink, we starve. His sons stood by, unspoken anxiety in their eyes. The spectre of losing fishing grounds, and thus food security, weighed as heavily as discussions of baselines and UN CLOS articles. Balton, to build legal and moral momentum, a consortium of Pacific Island nations drafted the Savannah's Declaration, a framework stating that climate-induced submergence of land shall not prejudice the sovereign rights of a coastal state over adjacent maritime zones, provided that such rights were established under existing international law before submergence. They circulated it among UN member states, seeking co-sponsorship for a new UN General Assembly resolution. At the UN's Sixth Committee, Legal, small island diplomats lobbied daily. They met with sympathetic representatives from developing countries, from coastal states in Africa to Caribbean nations also facing island loss. They argued that climate change driven by industrialized nations forced no-fault land loss on atoll states, and equity demanded protection of their maritime entitlements. They framed it not only as legal necessity but as climate justice. Wealthier nations must not reap ocean resources from surrendered islands. Western envoys expressed sympathy but hedged commitments. Some spoke of creative legal solutions but warned of complicated legal, geopolitical ramifications. Major players like the United States, though supportive in climate discussions, maintained reservations about altering UNCLOS baselines. In closed sessions, US legal advisors noted that expanding maritime claims for one group could prompt demands from mainland states to extend continental shelf limits, creating complexity. Baltazar. Amid the legal wrangling, islanders pressed ahead with practical adaptation. Kiribati's government launched an ambitious land reclamation and elevation project, constructing an artificial platform for new settlements and negotiating bilateral agreements to secure land in Fiji for possible relocation. Tuvalu established a sovereign climate resilience fund, financed by fishing license revenues to buy land abroad, although most leaders insisted they would never abandon home. They held pilgrimages to high tide markers, ceremonies to honor ancestors remembered beneath the waves, and youth conferences to craft digital postcards from the submerged islands for future generations. In Fiji, the government built floating causeways to connect dwindling islets, their pontoons rising on the crest of tides. Mangrove belts were replanted to slow coastal erosion, while offshore breakwaters were trialled as wave deflectors. Nurses patrolled salter-ridden water wells, bringing desalination units to homes near the waterlines. Community radio broadcasts provided daily tidal forecasts, advising villagers when to move livestock and store fresh water. Back in New York, Admiral Santos watched these developments with a mixture of hope and frustration. The UN resolution on maritime continuity, backed by 24 island and coastal states, had passed the General Assembly by a thin majority, but enforcement mechanisms were scant. Work continued in the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea to establish advisory opinions supporting island baseline continuity. The United States and the European Union expressed support for refugee assistance and resilience funding, but legal certainty remained elusive. Yet the global momentum was clear. International law was stretching to accommodate the unprecedented challenge of climate-induced land loss. Courts and tribunals, tasked with interpreting UNCLOS, would soon face cases testing the concept of baselines divorced from physical coastlines. Advisory opinions might establish precedents safeguarding atoll nations' EEZs, a lifeline for fishermen like Apitafuna, and a bulwark for national economies. Baltazar. On Namulaito's highest hill, Admiral Santos presided over a sunrise ceremony at the new Maritime Continuity Monument, a steel sculpture inscribed with the baselines established in 1970, three in a wave motif rising above them. Flags of Pacific nations fluttered in the breeze. Priya Natarajan and Captain Griswold stood at her side. President Aroha Tain read from the Coalition Declaration, "As our land recedes, our spirit endures. Our boundaries in the sea shall remain, honoring our people and our ancestors." Tears shone in the eyes of islanders and diplomats alike. Behind them, the ocean's edge rolled forward, and beyond it, the sun's first rays glimmered on the wayward tide. The journey to protect maritime rights had been long and fraught, but here, at the water's ever-shifting edge, communities had found a way to anchor their sovereignty not in sand or soil but in law, solidarity, and collective will. and as the waves embraced the reef below, the lines on the holographic map flickered, but the red arc of Namulaito's EEZ remained firm for now, a living testament that even as land disappears, the rights born upon it can, through determination and unity, endure beneath the rising sea. I first heard of Doggerland on a grey November afternoon in 2017, seated in a cramped conference room at the University of Groningen. The wind rattled the window panes as Dr. Sabine Verhoeven clicked through slides of sonar bathymetry, winding river channels, drumlin fields, and sinuous shoreline soils submerged beneath dozens of meters of North Sea water. "Imagine," she said, voice hushed, "a land bridge stretching from Britain to Denmark, larger than Wales, home to forests, hunters and fisherfolk. Then, after millennia of slow sea level rise, the land vanishes." Her words unfurled a world lost to time. I pictured Mesolithic bands following deer along flint-studded riverbeds, forging campfires on gravel terraces, tending orchards of hazelnut groves. Then, as glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, the sea rose first a trickle, then a flood-drowning Doggerland in stages. Around 500 BCE, the final low ridges succumbed, leaving only isolated shoals to mark the land's passing. That image of a drowned world stayed with me. A few years later, I found myself standing on the deck of the research vessel Odyssey, skirting the Dogger Bank in autumn's crisp winds. We towed sub-bottom profilers that pinged the seabed, revealing sediment layers like pages in a history book. Each core we pulled brought fragments: hazel pollen, burnt flint flakes, tidal muds rich with diatoms. I ran finger-o-thick sediment through my sieve and found an arrowhead flint napped with hand pressure, perhaps used to hunt elk or boar. When the mapping was done, the arrowhead rested on the lab bench, a testament to a vanished countryside, a fleeting settlement beneath waves. In the scientist's chatter, I heard more than academic marvel, a note of warning. If rising seas could erase a land as large as Doggerland, what of our coastlines today? Doggerland's disappearance had fragmented migration routes once connecting human populations across Europe. Prehistoric farmers adapted by following relict shorelines. Traders set new paths through burgeoning river deltas. Cultures diverged as water claimed the common ground. That fragmentation reshaped human history, new languages, distinct funerary practices, evolving technologies, all because the land beneath them slipped away. Years later, I travelled to Easter Island, Rapa Nui in the distant Pacific, another cautionary canvas. I arrived by small propeller plane, descending over aquamarine seas that vanished into a triangular island of green fields and volcanic cones. On the runway, I met my guide, Ma'u, a native Rapa Nui, whose ancestors witnessed the island's quieter collapse. As our van wound up a steep road past grazing sheep, Ma'u pointed to bare knolls once crowned with groves of now extinct palms. "Our ancestors," he said, "praised the trees' shade, their nuts, and their value as canoe masts. They saw no limit to what the land could give." In the 13th century, Polynesian settlers arrived on the island's fertile Lewis soils, rich in phosphorus and volcanic minerals. They cleared forests for gardens, built elaborate statues moyanned, erected ahu platforms signaling clan territories and ancestral veneration. For centuries, the community thrived on a diet of sweet potato, taro, fish, and the nuts of the native Pascula palm. But with each tree felled, windward soils lost protection, gulches deepened, topsoil washed into the sea. As palms vanished, the island's talus slopes turned to clay and sand, fertile fields became cracked earth. I hiked the crater rim of Rano Raraku, where moai had been carved and abandoned amid eroded slopes. In the quarry, hundreds of statues, mid-carving, stood like ghosts of a mastery undone. Their lines were precise. Their eyes seemed to watch over the island's destiny. Ma'u explained that as woods disappeared, the islanders lost the resources for boat building and transport, cutting them off from fishing grounds and trade. Soil fertility waned, yields fell, hunger rose. On the windswept Poik Peninsula, I spoke with archaeologist Dr. Elena Vargas as she brushed away soil from a collapsed ahu. "This is collapse archaeology," she said. "We see the story in stratigraphy. Forest pollen gives way to grass pollen dominance. Charcoal layers spike in mid-period, then drop off as firewood became scarce. We find fewer fish bones in later layers. People couldn't build canoes. Settlement sites shrink toward the shore, then vanish. She pointed to sediment cores from a former wetland, a marsh fed by freshwater springs, now filled with wind-blown silt. The island's ecology shifted, and with it the society's fortunes. I paused, staring at the empty crater. The ocean's roar below sounded a cautionary note. The islanders had lost their entire forest, their soil base, their transport means, and with them their resilience. Internal warfare over dwindling resources flared. The monumental statue project ceased. By the 18th century, the Rapa Nui were confined to a few coastal villages. European contact brought disease and slavery, compounding the legacy of environmental overshoot. In both Doggerland and Easter Island, the unifying thread was environmental mismanagement, whether through the unstoppable force of rising seas or the insatiable clearing of forests. These vanished worlds offered lessons for our time. Today, our coasts are at risk from warming-driven sea level rise of up to a metre by century's end. Our soils erode in the face of deforestation and poorly managed agriculture. Our fish stocks crumble under overfishing and habitat loss. If we do not heed the stories written in submerged sediments and collapsed quarries, we risk repeating the follies of antiquity. Back on the mainland, I joined a workshop at the Coastal Stewardship Alliance in Washington, D.C. Planners, engineers, tribal leaders, and conservationists had convened to share strategies for sustainable shoreline management. Over steaming coffee, I recounted the Doggerland dive show. Flint arrowheads and charcoal lay under the North Sea, a record of human adaptation and loss. I described Rapa Nui's stratigraphic story pollen slides, showing forest decline, bone assemblages revealing dietary collapse. The audience listened, some nodding in recognition, others bone-weary from fighting urban sprawl and climate chaos. We brainstormed patterns of environmental mismanagement, ignoring long-term ecological limits, overharvesting renewable resources, redirecting rivers, building on fertile floodplains, erecting hard engineering defenses that starve adjacent coasts. Each pattern echoed across space and time, from Mesolithic Europe to Polynesian Pacific to modern metropolises. If a depleted delta starves its wetlands, we witness a repeat of the soil loss tragedy on Easter Island. If coastal developments deny sediment to downdrift beaches, we enact the same coast fragmentation seen in Doggerland's drowned riverbeds. One speaker, Chief Marsha Red Elk of the Riverbend tribe, spoke of indigenous stewardship traditions that had preserved floodplain forests for centuries. Our ancestors knew the land was alive, she said. They honored trees as kin and kept grasses on riverbanks to hold soil. They rotated crops and let fields fallow. Colonization and corporate agriculture erased those practices, and now our waters run muddy. She called for reintegrating traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, into modern management, zoning policies that emulate rotational farming, buffer zone requirements, embedding native plants, and community-led forest restoration. Another delegate, Dr. Michael Thompson from the U.S. Geological Survey, unveiled a new sediment budget model for coastal deltas. We can quantify the sediment deficit, he explained. We see rivers trapped behind dams yielding fewer sands, coasts protected by seawalls eroding downdrift, and mangrove forests cleared for shrimp ponds letting currents chew channels deeper. By restoring sediment pathways through dam bypass projects, managed sediment diversions, and coastal revegetation, we can rebuild landscapes at risk. His model demonstrated how targeted interventions could recreate deltaic lobes like the Mississippi's Wax Lake diversioner, recharge disappearing island cores, much as mangrove restoration had begun rebuilding shorelines in Southeast Asia. By mid-afternoon, we had drafted a set of guiding principles for modern stewardship. Respect long-term Earth process timescales. Develop policies that look beyond short election cycles and focus on multi-one-decadal to centennial resilience. Maintain sediment continuity. Allow rivers and waves to carry their sand and silt. Restrict structures that interrupt sediment flows without delivering nourishment alternatives. Emulate natural systems. Use nature-based solutions, living shorelines, wetland restoration, agroforestry that blend human use and ecological function. Integrate traditional ecological knowledge. Honor and apply indigenous and local knowledge systems that have sustained communities for millennia. Plan for gradual and sudden changes. Incorporate both slow onset processes, sea level rise, subsidence, and acute shocks, storms, earthquakes, into adaptive management frameworks. Foster collaborative governance. Engage cross-jurisdictional coalitions from municipalities to nationing states to address landscape E-scale challenges. As evening fell, I stood on the Potomac's tidal edge, looking across shimmering water to the distant lights of Bethesda. I thought of Doggerland's drowned river valleys, of cliffs worn bare on Easter Island, of our own city waterfronts vulnerable to an uncertain climate. The wind carried the echo of vanishing land scortions from lost worlds whispering across time. In my mind's eye, I saw Mesolithic hunters navigating emergent channels. I saw Rapa Nui families clearing the last palm trunk. I saw modern planners signing resilience pacts. The patterns were clear. Whether through neglect or hubris, humanity repeatedly tests ecological limits and pays the price. But now we have something new: data, models, and cross-cultural collaboration. We can map disappeared lands, reconstruct collapsed societies, and extract warnings from the geological record. Doggerland's arrowheads tell us that people adapt, migrate, and innovate when coastlines retreat. Easter Island's moai teach us that cultural flourish does not guarantee sustainability without resource limits. Combined with modern tools, remote sensing, numerical models, GIS, climate scenarios possess unprecedented foresight. We can identify shorelines destined to drown, soils nearing their erosion threshold, rivers silted behind dams. We can design interventions that work with nature's processes rather than fight them. And so I walked back along the riverbank, resolving to share these stories far and wide. I would write op-eds on preventing new Doggerlands, advocate for TEK in coastal planning, speak at conferences on nature-based engineering. I would urge communities to plant dunes and forests, to set back levees, to nourish beaches with sand, to reconnect rivers to their floodplains, to legalize rolling easements rather than hard seawalls. If these measures fail, we risk repeating the cautionary tales etched in mud layers and collapsed quarries, stories of worlds lost, of cultures fractured, of futures foreclosed. Standing there in the cool evening air, I felt the weight of vanished lands beneath my boots and the promise of stewardship in my heart. The lessons lay in the sediment: honor the earth's rhythms, heed its warnings, and manage our soils, sands, and waters with humility. Only then might we prevent modern analogues of Doggerland's fragmentation and Easter Island's collapse. Only then might our lands endure for generations yet to come. I first saw the scarred coastline at dusk, the sky a bruise of purple and gold, as I stepped onto the deck of the research catamaran Artemis. Below me, limestone cliffs tumbled into turbulent surf, and farther offshore, a cluster of half-submerged mounds marked the outline of islands that no longer were. We'd come to chart their remnants, foundations of stone marked by barnacles, lines of column drums, weathered steps leading into the deep. These vanished islands were more than geological curiosities. They were harbingers of a world in flux, reminders of Earth's ceaseless dynamism and our own fleeting tenure upon the land. Our captain, Lena Marino, eased the vessel into a calm tidal pool formed by a submerged reef. She shut off the engines, and with a snap of her head, her deckhand lowered a ROV into the water. Its bright LED lights sliced through emerald green, illuminating the ruined walls of a once proud trading port that had prospered under a warmer, lower sea. Now, that port lay stranded underwater, its docks reclaimed by the tide. Inclined planes that once hosted merchants' carts lay carpeted in silt. Bollards once used to tie ships lay surrounded by coral. As the ROV's camera tracked along, I felt shivers. This was a city reduced to memory, its stories preserved by water. I recalled the data we'd studied in the lab. High-resolution bathymetric maps had revealed terraces and canal-still-tail signatures of human planning. Radiocarbon dates from submerged peat layers had placed the final inundation around the 7th century CE in the aftermath of a magnitude 8 earthquake that collapsed the island's central plateau. Over decades, minor tremors, combined with eustatic sea level rise, had bled the land away. Generations of inhabitants watched the shoreline recede, even as they built seawalls and breakwaters that only hastened coastal erosion downstream. Eventually they abandoned their homes, leaving behind homesick ghosts of stone and tile. Land may disappear, I thought as the ROV surfaced, but the machines of human ingenuity reached in submerged streets and sunken quays. Back on shore, we hiked the narrow path to a low ridge, where a modern lighthouse cast its beam across open water. There, perched on a bluff of half-eroded clay, I met Dr. Marisol Vance, an ecologist who had led efforts to restore native marshes in the same region. She stooped to show me a patch of newly sprouted cordgrass Spartina alterniflora planted a year ago. Behind her, a living shoreline experiment unfolded. Oyster reef breakwaters had been built offshore to break wave energy and capture sediment, while the marsh traps the sand, gradually rebuilding the coastline from the seaward side. "These cordgrasses," she said, troweling a plug of black, mucky soil, "work like living nails driven into the earth. Their roots bind the sediment, their blades dissipate wave energy. Over time, we expect this little fringe of marsh to advance seaward at a rate of 0.5 meter per year." I looked back at the vanishing islands, the ruins we'd just charted. A landscape that once lay above water was now reborn in this coastal experiment land, rebuilding itself in loops of collapse and renewal. Nature and engineering, working together, forging a resilient edge. Engineering with ecosystems, Dr. Vance continued, is the future. We've learned that seawalls and groins can exacerbate erosion by starving downdrift beaches of sand. But when we blend hard structures like breakwaters with ecosystem restoration like marsh planting, we can capture sediment and let the coast grow itself. We walked along the bluff's edge, where a park had replaced a crumbling seawall. Beneath benches, floodgates slotted into frames could be deployed during storms, while native shrubs and dune grasses took root in stabilized soil. A sign explained the design. "Here, we welcome the waves on our terms. We give them room to flow while protecting our homes." That evening, I flew back to the city to attend a roundtable on managed retreat. Urban planners, policymakers, and community leaders gathered in a conference center overlooking the very shoreline we'd been studying. The chairs faced a large map of the region, overlaid with color-coded hazard zones, red for high risk, orange for moderate risk, and green for low risk. Panelists discussed which neighborhoods to defend, which to facilitate adaptive measures for, and which to eventually relocate inland. Mayor Elaine Chong spoke first. "We cannot build seawalls forever," she said. "As land retreats, we must rethink our relationship with the coast. Some places will be worth defending critical infrastructure, cultural sites. But in other areas, we must plan for a graceful retreat, offering buyouts or relocation assistance, turning old neighborhoods into ecological reserves." Her words elicited nods and murmurs. The reality was stark. Rising seas and sinking ground demanded choices, some tough, some irreversible. Next, urban designer Julian Stein presented a concept for a floating district modular platforms that rise with the water, anchored to deep pilings. "We're looking at neighborhoods built on floating foundations," he explained. "Imagine homes, offices, and parks that adapt to the tide, permanent, yet flexible." Visualizations showed tree-lined canals where brick houses perched on pontoons in quiet coves. The audience leaned forward, intrigued by this blend of futurism and pragmatism. Finally, community organizer Rosa Martinez detailed how her coastal neighborhood had come together to shape their own future. "We formed a residents' council," she said. "We worked with scientists to map our own flood risk. We voted to build a new seawall behind our homes, but we also created an inland greenbelt, a zone where houses will be bought out over the next decade. We plant mangroves in the old seawall's shadow, install communal docks, and teach local children about tidal cycles. We're not leaving, we're transforming." Applause rippled through the room. In my hotel room that night, I reflected on vanished islands and disappearing land. I thought of Doggerland's drowned plains, where arrowheads lie beneath waves, of Easter Island's collapsed ecology, where forests vanished under overexploitation, of the Mediterranean port, swallowed by tectonics and gyres. Each example offered a cautionary tale. Ignore the limits of your environment, and you may witness the undoing of your own home. But they also offered hope. Human ingenuity, like ghost machines buried beneath waves, endures in memory and rediscovery. In Greenland's Norse settlements, we find remains of turf walls repurposed by Inuit for new uses. In flood-adapted Dutch polders, we see an artful dance with water through centuries of dike building and controlled flooding. In the bay I called home, we blend engineering solutions breakwaters, floodgates, elevated boardwalks with ecosystem restoration marshes, oyster reefs, mangrove stow-craft resilience. Above all, I realized we must heed the ocean's lessons. Land may disappear, but what humans build in stone or steel, in memory or model can, guide us across collapse and renewal. We must respect shifting coastlines, not fight them blindly. We must blend hard engineering with living ecosystems, letting nature's wisdom guide our designs. And where defense proves unsustainable, we must plan for managed retreat, preserving community bonds and cultural heritage even as we change the land beneath our feet. In the weeks that followed, I wrote up our findings, a narrative weaving vanished islands, ecosystem engineering, adaptive planning, and managed retreat. I proposed a coastal resilience charter, calling on cities worldwide to embrace principles of integration, humility, and foresight. I shared our data with planners in Bangkok, New York, Lagos, and Jakarta, places where coastal dynamics shape human destiny. As I pressed send on the final draft, I paused, imagining the authors the Mesolithic fishers of Doggerland, the Rapa Nui carvers of Easter Island, the founders of the sunken port, all gazing from depths or altars, guardians of lessons learned and promises unkept. Then I closed my laptop, stepping onto the balcony, where the night's breeze carried salt and possibility. The ocean's dark expanse beckoned, a timeless partner in change. And in that moment I knew, as land disappears, our ingenuity must endure a shaping, renewing and rising once more in loops of collapse and rebirth. I first encountered the power of change on a misty morning in early spring, standing atop a ruined lighthouse on what was once called Harriman Island. From my vantage point, I could see the pale curve of the coast Linno, a fringe of low dune sand, the waves swirling around a cluster of submerged boulders that marked the old harbour's breakwater. A half-sunken jetty, its pilings rotted and barnacled, pointed east toward open water. The map in my hand, a detailed chart of shoreline positions from the 19th century, overlaid with recent satellite imagery, showed dense lines where the island's landward edge had retreated nearly 200 meters in just 60 years. It was a stark lesson. Coastal landscapes are alive, breathing in tides, storms, and shifting sediments. In an era of accelerating change, we must learn to map wisely, build responsibly, and remember that as islands vanish, new lands emerge, stewardship shaping which of these become our home. My journey began in a cramped mapping office at the Coastal Geospatial Institute, where rows of computer monitors displayed a patchwork of data LiDAR point clouds, bathymetric surveys, drone-shot mosaics. Dr. Javier Morales, the Institute's Director of Remote Sensing, guided me through their latest innovations. He showed me a dynamic coastal digital twin, a virtual Earth where every grain of sand and pool of water was modeled in 3 dimensions, updated daily with satellite feeds and sensor data. Here, he said, clicking on a shifting line, is Point Grey Island. 10 years ago it had a stable shoreline. Now Luxembourg erosion removed that spit. Winter storms took the northern bluff. He brought up graph after graph. Rates of shoreline retreat, vertical land motion from GPS stations, tide gauge records showing accelerating sea level rise. They had even deployed acoustic sensors along the reef crest to measure wave energy and estimate sediment transport. Each data stream was a thread in a living tapestry. They wove them together with machine learning algorithms that predicted shoreline change months or years in advance. Mapping is no longer static, Javier declared. We're no longer charting where the land was, we're forecasting where it will be. I watched as the model simulated a storm surge coinciding with a king tide. In seconds, the virtual shoreline moved inland by 30 meters, overtopping dunes and flooding marsh channels. Then, just as quickly, wave-driven sediment was redeposited further landward, carving a new Burma-tentative nascent dune, awaiting the next storm's scouring. The map glowed with vibrant colors, marking areas of potential accretion and erosion. It was a living forecast that blended past, present, and future. Armed with these foresight maps, communities began to build responsibly. On the island of Marisol, local engineers and ecologists collaborated to develop an integrated coastal resilience plan. They identified 3 strategies: defend, accommodate, or retreat choices tailored to each shoreline segment's vulnerability and value. In the town's busy harbour, a modest seawall was reinforced with living breakwaters concrete units seeded with oyster spat and wrapped in coir fibre to foster marsh grass growth. Boats dock amid a fringe of cordgrass whose roots bind the shoreline, dissipating wave energy and trapping silt carried in by tides. Behind the wall, a raised promenade offers a gathering place for markets and festivals. Its foundations rest on pilings driven deep into stable sediments. Just south lies a residential neighbourhood perched on a former dune ridge. Here, planners chose to accommodate. Houses stand on stilts, their garages and storage areas left intentionally open to allow floodwaters to pass beneath with minimal damage. Streets were raised and crowned, with permeable paving that channels excess water into bioswales lined with native shrubs. When heavy rains or storm surges come, neighbours say, the water comes in quietly, then subsides without leaving a trail of destruction. Further north, beyond the protected harbour and elevated homes, lies a low-wallying salt marsh valued more for its ecological services than for private property. Here, the plan calls for managed retreat, no seawalls, no stilts. Instead, a rolling easement ensures that as sea level rises, roads and structures are relocated inland, while the marsh itself migrates landward, nourished by natural processes and fortified by living shorelines. Over time, what was once farmland will become tidal creek networks, a living buffer against storms for the defences to the south. I visited one of the villages engaged in this managed retreat. As my boat approached the old docks, I passed newly planted mangrove saplings, red and white mangroves whose prop roots cradle fine mud, encouraging sediment to settle. Each sapling had been placed by community volunteers in a grid pattern, with wreaths of eelgrass wrapped around their bases to protect against wave scour. Over months, the saplings drew oyster spat, and within a year, small clusters of oysters dotted the bases, filtering water and cementing the mud. Gone were the shuttered storefronts once covered in flood damage. In their place stood elevated boardwalks leading to new community gardens on raised beds. The harvest of salt-tolerant vegetables, Swiss chard, kale, sorghum for schoolchildren, and demonstrated life beyond the old shoreline. I met a young farmer named Rena, who had grown up in the old village and now taught agronomy classes in the new settlement. She held up a head of rainbow chard, its leaves shimmering in the midday sun. My mother could not have grown this here 10 years ago, she said. But now, with soil enriched by tidal sediments and covered with oyster shells, it thrives. Across the village green, I found former school banners repurposed as shade cloths over picnic tables. Children played under their cheerful colours, their laughter echoing off the sturdy pilings even as the tide rose in the channel beyond. Rena led me to a children's art project mounted on a walla mural depicting the old island eroding into the sea, then a new marsh rising like emerald lace, and finally, the new village settled safely inland. Beneath, a simple motto: change is our future, we build with it. Yet for every success story, the ghosts of vanished islands linger. I recalled the Mesolithic fissures of Doggerland, whose paths were drowned by rising seasons hunters, then boat builders, then migrants forced to follow receding shores. I recalled the Rapa Nui of Easter Island, whose forest clearing led to soil collapse, cultural upheaval, and eventual reduction of their civilization's footprint. Their moai stand silent amid powdery slopes, stately testaments to human ambition tempered by environmental limits. In my travels, I came upon archaeological sites, revealed only when powerful storms stripped away sands that had buried them. Moorland mounds in the North Sea, submerged shrines in the Mediterranean, Roman fish farms in the English Channel all resurfacing momentarily before the waves reclaimed them. Beneath the tides lay ghost machines of the past, aqueducts, water wheels, fish trap shearlooms of ingenuity lost to forgotten seas. Scholars' video recorded them, 3D printing fragments to preserve their forms. Yet each find rang a warning. Human creations, no matter how wondrous, are vulnerable when the earth shifts beneath them. I met Dr. Yusuf Al-Khatib, a geomorphologist who studies submerged cities in the Mediterranean. He told me of Alexandria's ancient ports, now underwater, and of oyster beds half covering broken columns. Our ancestors built marvels, he said, but they did not foresee sea level rise measured in centimeters per century. Today, we face a rate 100 times faster. If we do not heed the lessons from these sunken ruins, our own ghost machines may lie beneath waves for future generations to discover. These vanished islands and lost landscapes are not just relics, they are cautionary tales and guides. They remind us that the Earth is dynamic, that coastlines breathe in response to climate and geology, and that our own tenure on these landscapes is provisional. In this age of accelerating change, stewardship demands three intertwined commitments. We must harness the full power of remote sensing, continuous monitoring, and predictive modeling. Our maps must be living documents, updated in real time and forecasting future change, not simply recording the past. We need digital twins of our coasts that show us how each dune, marsh, and reef responds to storms, tides, and human activity. By mapping wisely, we equip ourselves to anticipate challenges and seize opportunities. Engineering must evolve from hard, static barricades to flexible hybrid systems. We blend steel and stone with oysters and spartina, seawalls with wetlands, barriers with bays. We plan for levees that allow flood pulses in non-critical areas, flood-proof buildings that accept occasional inundation, and elevated promenades that strengthen community ties even as the water rises. We must prioritize nature-based solutions where feasible living shorelines, sand nourishment, managed aquifer recharge and reserve hard defenses for critical infrastructure. Every project, from harbour renovations to neighbourhood parks, must integrate ecological resilience. Some places cannot be defended indefinitely or at any price. Where hazards are extreme, assets are non-critical, and migration pathways exist, we must plan for retreat. That means establishing rolling easements, crafting land use policies that allow natural shoreline migration, and offering fair compensation for relocation. It means investing in human capital, training workforces to adapt, ensuring cultural continuity in new locations, and preserving heritage through archives, museums, and Story Circle 7 as the physical ground shifts beneath us. Yet, while some lands vanish, new lands emerge. Sediment-starved coasts can be rebuilt with nourishment. Former tidal flats can accrete into marsh. Controlled flooding can create fertile floodplain parks. Dredged channels can form sheltered lagoons. Communities can rejoice as new dunes rise. Oyster reefs cultivate, and beaches widen, inviting recreation and wildlife. These new lands can become our homes places of solace and prosperity, born of collaboration between human and nature. On the barrier island we visited at the outset, once dwindling under storm onslaught, marsh planting and sand nourishment have reclaimed a broad beach. Houses once boarded up now sport pastel facades and solar-powered pumps. A boardwalk hosts summer farmers markets and winter bird-watching tours. The old lighthouse ruins have been stabilized, surrounded by interpretive trails telling the stories of submerged villages and soil erosion experiments. Tourists walk these trails in cotton hats, pausing at placards that read, "This beach was rebuilt with 50 0 mile blanks of sand and 10 0 marsh plugs. Return soon for the next chapter in our ever-changing coastline." The cycle is ancient. The earth pulses in loops of collapse and renewal. Islands are born from volcanic fire, only to erode under wind and wave. Deltas burgeon with silt, then subside under their own weight. Coasts realign as tectonic forces reshape shelves. Climate swings usher in ice ages and warm transgressions, drowning forests and revealing seabeds. In each cycle, we humans adapt, migrating, building, transforming our landscapes and cultures. Vanished islands, Doggerland. Easter Islands, forests. Lost Port Said chapters in that story. They remind us of impermanence, of the planet's power, and of our own small place within these narratives. But they also demonstrate resilience, ingenuity rediscovered in ghost machines, our societies reshaping shorelines in loops of renewal. As I disembarked from the Artemis, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sea's surface glowed with dying embers. The new dunes behind me whispered in the breeze, and the marsh below hummed with crickets and frogs. The world I left this living coastline was neither static nor certain, but a testament to the promise of stewardship rooted in wisdom and humility. In an era of accelerating change, let us map wisely, build responsibly, and remember, Land may disappear, but our ingenuity kindled by memory and guided by knowledge endures. We are the stewards of these shores, curators of new lands born from tides and sediments. May we choose to shape them into homes that last, knowing that while we cannot freeze the coastline, we can embrace its dynamism and ensure that the next chapters in our shared story shine as brightly as this glowing twilight etched upon dunes, reefs, and hearts alike.